Here is something worth knowing before we begin. The Simpsons did not start as a television show. It started as a 30-second filler sketch on a variety program that most people have completely forgotten existed. And the version of the show that emerged from those tiny, rough, barely animated clips looks almost nothing like the polished, globally recognized institution that eventually took over Sunday nights and never left. The path from that first rough sketch to the longest-running animated series in American history is longer and stranger than almost anyone remembers, and it is full of decisions that could have gone entirely differently, moments where the whole thing nearly collapsed before it had the chance to become anything at all. So, settle in, get comfortable, because we are going to start at the very beginning, before the theme song, before the couch gag, before any of it. We are going to start with a man sitting in a waiting room in 1987, sketching a family on a notepad, trying to think of names. Fact 1. Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, came up with the Simpson family in approximately 15 minutes. He was sitting in the waiting room outside producer James L. Brooks's office at The Tracy Ullman Show, scheduled to pitch a completely different idea. The idea he had planned to pitch was an adaptation of his comic strip Life in Hell, a dark, absurdist comic featuring a rabbit named Binky and a cast of recurring characters that Groening had been drawing since his college years. Life in Hell had a small but devoted following in alternative newspapers, and Groening had been building it quietly for years. It was personal, it was his, and as he sat in that waiting room, he realized something that would change the course of television history. If he signed over the rights to Life in Hell for an animated adaptation, he would lose control of the thing he had spent the better part of a decade creating, and he was not willing to do that. So, he threw out the plan entirely. He invented something new, right there in the waiting room, scribbling on a legal pad. He named the father Homer after his own father. He named the mother Marge after his own mother. He named the son Bart, which was an anagram of the word brat, a word Groening thought captured the character precisely. He named the daughters Lisa and Maggie after his own sisters. And he sketched a deliberately simple family design, a drawing style so basic that he figured any animator could replicate it quickly. The whole thing, from blank page to named, designed family, took around 15 minutes. That's the origin of one of the most recognizable fictional families in human history. Fact 2. The Simpsons shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show began airing on April 19, 1987. They were genuinely crude, not stylistically simplified the way the finished show eventually became, but genuinely rough and unpolished. The characters' proportions shifted from clip to clip. Homer's hair changed shape. The children looked different depending on who was animating the scene. Groening himself has acknowledged that the early shorts were not what he had envisioned, partly because the production process was rushed, and partly because there was no established Bible for how the characters should look. The show was finding itself in real time, in public, between segments of a sketch comedy show that not that many people were watching. Fact 3. There were 48 Tracy Ullman Show shorts in total before The Simpsons became its own half-hour series. 48. That is almost 3 full seasons of content that most people have never seen, produced in an era before streaming, before DVD box sets, before any reliable way to preserve and distribute this material to a wider audience. Some of these shorts have surfaced online over the years. Watching them next to a modern Simpsons episode is a genuinely disorienting experience. The characters are present, the voices are mostly in place, but the show feels like a distant relative of itself. It is recognizable in the way that a very old photograph of a living person is recognizable. You can see who it is, but everything about it is slightly wrong. Fact 4. Matt Groening did not originally intend for Homer to be the central character of the show. In the earliest conception, the family was meant to function more as an ensemble, with Bart as the de facto lead. The show's original working title reflected this. It was called The Simpsons, but the marketing and promotional materials from the first season leaned heavily on Bart as the face of the franchise. Bart was the one on the merchandise. Bart was the one in the promotional art. The cultural phenomenon of Bartmania in the early 90s confirmed this positioning in the public imagination. Bart was the star. Homer was the bumbling father in the background. The gradual shift of focus toward Homer, his interior life, his emotional hunger, his strange resilience and stranger stupidity, happened slowly across the first several seasons, and it was largely driven by the writing staff recognizing that Homer was funnier and, in many ways, more emotionally rich than they had initially realized. Fact 5. The decision to make The Simpsons a half-hour primetime series was not initially enthusiastic on the part of the network. Fox was a very young network in 1989. It had been operating for only 2 years, and its track record was thin. The executives who greenlit The Simpsons as a series were operating largely on instinct and on the credibility of James L. Brooks, who was already a television legend through his work on The Mary Tyler Moore Show and Taxi. Brooks was the one who championed the show internally. Without his involvement, there is a strong argument that The Simpsons never gets made as a series at all. It stays in its waiting room, a collection of filler shorts between comedy sketches, and disappears with The Tracy Ullman Show when that program eventually ends. Fact 6. The Simpsons premiered on December 17, 1989, with an episode called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, a Christmas special that was originally intended to air as the 8th episode of the first season, not the first. The premiere order was reshuffled because the original first episode, Some Enchanted Evening, ran into serious animation problems. The animation that came back from the overseas studio was so bad, so fundamentally off from what had been intended, that the producers refused to air it. They sent it back for complete rework, which took months. So the Christmas special went first by default. This means the very first episode of one of the longest-running television series in history was an emergency substitute for a different episode that was not ready yet. Fact 7. Some Enchanted Evening. That original intended first episode eventually aired as the 13th episode of the first season, after it had been almost entirely reanimated. The episode involves a babysitter who turns out to be a wanted criminal, and it is a fine episode. But it carries this strange historical weight when you know what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to introduce The Simpsons to the world. Instead, it became a footnote, an asterisk, the episode that almost was the beginning and ended up being the near end of the first season. Fact 8. The first season of The Simpsons had a budget of approximately $1 million per episode. That sounds like a significant amount of money, and for 1989, it was. But it was still considerably less than what live-action dramas were spending at the same time. The production was under constant financial pressure, and a significant portion of the animation work was outsourced to a studio in South Korea called Klasky Supo, which would handle the bulk of animation production through the first 3 seasons. The relationship between the American production team and the Korean animation studio was one of the defining tensions of those early years. Communication was slow. Notes had to travel across a significant time difference. The results were sometimes exactly what had been requested, and sometimes so far from the intention that entire scenes had to be redone. Fact 9. Klasky Supo, the animation studio responsible for those early seasons, was founded by Arlene Klasky and Gabor Supo, and they went on to produce a number of other animated series including Rugrats and Aha! Real Monsters. Their visual style, which is characterized by slightly rubbery characters and a certain organic roughness, is genuinely distinctive. Fans of early Simpsons often describe seasons 1 through 3 as having a different energy than the later show. A slightly darker color palette, slightly more angular character designs, slightly more expressive and exaggerated emotion. A lot of that quality comes directly from the Klasky Supo aesthetic. When the show transitioned to film Roman for the animation in season 4, the visual style smoothed out considerably, and some fans find they prefer one era over the other in the way that music fans argue about a band's early albums versus their later work. Fact 10. The voice cast of The Simpsons was assembled in a way that was less deliberate than the mythology around the show might suggest. Dan Castellaneta, who voices Homer, was already working as a cast member on The Tracy Ullman Show. He was simply available. He had never done cartoon voice work before. His initial Homer voice was loosely based on Walter Matthau, that rumbling, world-weary cadence that Matthau brought to every role he ever played. Over time, as the character evolved, Homer's voice evolved with it, moving away from the Matthau influence and becoming something entirely Castellaneta's own. Fact 11. Julie Kavner, who voices Marge, was also already on The Tracy Ullman Show. Her distinctive voice, that slightly hoarse, warm quality, is not performed. It is simply how she sounds. Kavner has famously kept a very low public profile throughout the show's run, rarely giving interviews and almost never attending public events in connection with the show. She is by some accounts the most private of the main cast members, a significant achievement on a show whose cast has been consistently in the public eye for more than 3 decades. Fact 12. Nancy Cartwright, who voices Bart Simpson, originally auditioned for the role of Lisa. She found Bart more interesting during the audition process and asked if she could try that role instead. The producers agreed, and she got the part. Cartwright was 29 years old when she first voiced Bart Simpson as a 10-year-old boy. She has now been doing this for nearly 40 years, which makes her decade-long relationship with a fictional child's voice one of the longest sustained vocal performances in entertainment history. Fact 13. Yeardley Smith, who voices Lisa, has the most distinctive voice of the main cast in one specific way. Her speaking voice and her performance voice for Lisa are remarkably close to identical. Most voice actors undergo a significant transformation when they step into a character. Yeardley Smith essentially does not. Lisa Simpson sounds like Yeardley Smith talking at a slightly elevated register with a bit more emotional expressiveness. Smith has discussed this in interviews, noting that she was initially concerned that her voice was simply too unusual for mainstream work, too nasal, too distinctive. The Simpsons turned that perceived liability into one of the most recognizable voices in the world. Fact 14. Harry Shearer, who voices Mr. Burns, Smithers, Ned Flanders, Principal Skinner, Kent Brockman, and somewhere between 15 and 20 other recurring characters depending on how you count, has described the challenge of keeping all these voices distinct as a kind of ongoing puzzle. Each character, in Shearer's conception, has a specific physical location where the voice is produced. Burns lives in the back of the throat. Ned is nasal and forward. Skinner is tight and slightly strangled. Shearer developed this system over time as the number of characters he was responsible for kept expanding. In the early seasons, he had fewer characters to manage. As the show deepened its world and populated Springfield with recurring figures, his workload became extraordinary. Fact 15. Hank Azaria, the other primary male voice actor alongside Shearer, voices Apu, Moe, Chief Wiggum, Professor Frink, and dozens of others. His process for character voices is somewhat different from Shearer's. Azaria tends to find his characters through physical sensation, the way a particular voice feels in his body, the tension or relaxation it requires. Apu was based on a convenience store clerk he observed in New York. Moe was partially inspired by Al Pacino's performance in Dog Day Afternoon. Chief Wiggum was informed by Ed Asner, that blustery, good-natured incompetence that Asner brought to certain roles. Azaria built an entire cast of characters out of cultural fragments he had absorbed over a lifetime of watching movies and television and listening to people talk. Fact 16. The original Simpsons pitch to Fox included something that never made it into the show. In Groening's original conception, the Simpson family had a cat. Not just any cat, a specific, recurring cat with personality and storylines. The dog, Santa's little helper, made it through the development process and became a genuine part of the family. The cat was eventually dropped. There have been various explanations offered over the years, including that the cat felt redundant once the dog was established, and that having two animals complicated the animation. A version of a family cat did eventually appear in one memorable episode as Snowball the First, the family's previous cat who died before the series began. Snowball the Second, the cat the family actually has, arrived as a gift in the first season, which means the show technically has always had a cat. But the original, more prominent cat character from the pitch never appeared. Fact 17. The very first couch gag was not actually intended to be a recurring bit. The couch gag was introduced as a flexible segment within the opening sequence, a way to make the title card section expandable or contractible depending on how long the episode was running. If the episode was long, the couch gag would be brief. If the episode came in short, the couch gag could be extended to fill time. This purely practical production solution accidentally became one of the most beloved recurring elements of the show, something fans anticipate every episode, something animators and directors compete to make memorable, something that has been analyzed and cataloged with the kind of rigor usually reserved for things that actually matter in the real world. Fact 18. The chalkboard gag, Bart's opening punishment where he writes a sentence repeatedly on a classroom chalkboard, was similarly flexible in the early seasons. The earliest chalkboard gags were relatively straightforward punishments, things that a real school might actually make a child write. Over time, they became increasingly absurdist, self-referential, and elaborate. Some of the most beloved chalkboard gags are the ones that make no sense as punishments whatsoever, sentences that no teacher would ever assign, ideas that only make sense as jokes. The chalkboard gag is also frequently the first casualty when an episode runs long. Viewers have noted seasons where the chalkboard gag disappeared for multiple consecutive episodes because the show was simply too full to include it. Fact 19. Matt Groening named the town of Springfield deliberately for its ubiquity. Springfield is one of the most common city names in the United States. There are Springfields in Oregon, Illinois, Massachusetts, Missouri, Ohio, Virginia, and more than a dozen other states. The choice was intentional. Groening wanted the show to feel like it could be set anywhere, and choosing the most generic possible American city name was a simple, elegant way to accomplish that. He has confirmed in interviews that he grew up near Springfield, Oregon, which is where the personal connection comes in. But the functional reason for the name is the universality it implies. Fact 20. The yellow skin color of the Springfield residents was a deliberate choice, but it was not Matt Groening's choice. It came from the colorist working on the show in its early days, a woman named Georgi Pelouse. The instruction given to the colorists was simply to use colors that were unusual and distinctive, colors that would stand out from the flesh tones of live-action television. Yellow was chosen for The Simpsons themselves because it popped on screen and because it was, crucially, a color that no one else was using. The yellow skin was never meant to represent anything specific. It was a production decision made for optical clarity. It became instead one of the most recognizable visual signatures in the history of the medium. Fact 21. The show's famous theme, composed by Danny Elfman, was written in a single day. Elfman has described the commission as one of the fastest and most enjoyable pieces of work he has ever done. He was given a brief that was essentially just fun, slightly chaotic, family-friendly. He sat down, wrote the theme, recorded it, and delivered it. The production team loved it immediately. There were no significant revisions. The piece that Elfman wrote in that single session is essentially identical to what has been playing at the beginning of every episode since 1989. Elfman has since gone on to score hundreds of films and television shows, many of them far more elaborate and prestigious, but The Simpsons theme remains among the most recognized pieces of music he has ever written. Fact 22. The original Bible for The Simpsons, the document that described the characters, the world, the tone, and the rules of Springfield for the benefit of writers and producers, was surprisingly thin. Early television Bibles tend to be comprehensive documents. They define character psychology, list backstory in detail, establish the physical geography of the show's world. The Simpsons Bible was relatively brief because, in those early days, Groening and the producers were still figuring out what the show was. The characters were broader, less defined, more sketch-like. Homer was meaner and more aggressive. Marge was quieter and more passive. Bart was simpler and more cartoonish. The versions of these characters that we came to know developed organically over the first 2 seasons as writers discovered who these people actually were through the process of writing them into situations and listening to what the voices did with the material. Drop a comment below telling us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're watching from. And if you are enjoying this so far, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it helps more than you might think. Now, let us keep going. Number section 2. The characters were almost completely different. Facts 23 through 44. Every character you think you know from The Simpsons went through a version of themselves that you would not recognize. Some of them were pitched as completely different archetypes. Some of them were going to be played by different actors. Some of them were going to be killed off, written out, or transformed into something unrecognizable by the end of the first season. The finished characters, the Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie who have lived on Evergreen Terrace for 36 years, exist because of a series of decisions made under pressure, in haste, and sometimes against the creator's own instincts. Understanding who they almost were makes it easier to appreciate who they ended up being. Fact 23. Homer Simpson was, in early drafts of the character, genuinely unpleasant in a way that the show eventually moved away from. Early Homer was not just foolish and impulsive, he was actively mean. He was the kind of television father who would say cutting things to his children without realizing they were cutting. He would lash out at Marge in ways that went beyond cartoon exaggeration into something that felt more like genuine cruelty. The writers and producers recognized early in the first season that this version of Homer was difficult to root for, and a character you cannot root for is a problem in the center seat of a family sitcom. The process of softening Homer, of giving him more vulnerability, more genuine love for his family, more of the sweet, bumbling quality that eventually came to define him, was gradual. By season 3 or 4, Homer had become a fundamentally different character than the one who appeared in season 1. Warmer, sadder, more openly desperate for love and connection. The mean streak never disappeared entirely, but it stopped being the first thing you noticed about him. Fact 24. Bart Simpson was almost named Matt. This was an early suggestion that reflected the show's semi-autobiographical origins. Groening named Homer and Marge after his parents. Naming the son Matt would have completed the self-portrait. But Groening ultimately felt that naming the troublemaking central child after himself was too on the nose, too precious. The name Bart emerged partly from the anagram logic, partly from a desire for a name that felt scrappy and slightly old-fashioned. The kind of name a kid from the 50s or 60s might have had. Bart is a name that sounds a little like a cartoon sound effect. It lands hard. It has a blunt quality that suits the character. Fact 25. Lisa Simpson was originally conceived as the quiet, bookish counterpoint to Bart's chaos. And while that description still holds in the finished show, the early conception of Lisa was considerably less defined in terms of her inner life. The depth that Lisa eventually developed, her genuine intellectual and emotional complexity, her sense of justice, her loneliness, her saxophone, came from the writing staff finding her voice over time. Specifically, it came from writers who connected with Lisa's sense of being the smartest person in a room that didn't want to listen. That experience of being perceptive and articulate in an environment that found those qualities inconvenient gave Lisa a real psychological texture that the original pitch had barely sketched. Fact 26. Maggie Simpson was almost given a speaking role in the first season. There were early script drafts in which Maggie would occasionally produce full sentences, surprising the other characters and then going silent again. The joke was essentially that Maggie was holding out, choosing when to reveal her full capabilities. This idea was abandoned because the silence proved funnier and more mysterious. A baby who says nothing is more interesting than a baby who occasionally says things. The decision to keep Maggie permanently pre-verbal ended up being one of the defining creative choices of the show, and it opened up an entirely separate comedic register for the character that would have been unavailable if she spoke regularly. Fact 27. Montgomery Burns was not supposed to be the primary villain of the show. In early planning discussions, Burns was envisioned as a recurring antagonist for Homer at work, a powerful and unpleasant presence in Homer's professional life, but not necessarily the dominant figure in the show's larger mythology. He became that figure because Harry Shearer's performance was so precisely calibrated to the character's evil that the writers found themselves increasingly interested in exploring what Burns could do. The more they wrote for him, the more they discovered about him. His contempt for the modern world, his disorientation in any situation that requires him to relate to other human beings, his genuine, almost touching bewilderment at the concept of ordinary life. Burns grew into the show's central antagonist organically, through a series of episodes that kept peeling back new layers and finding more darkness underneath each one. Fact 28. Ned Flanders was originally written as a straight-up villain, not a cartoon villain in the Burns mold, but a specifically suburban kind of villain. A neighbor whose visible success and relentless pleasantness concealed something genuinely threatening. The early conception of Ned was closer to the satirical portrait of cheerful middle-class conformity that shows up in American literature and film, the smiling neighbor who makes you feel vaguely uncomfortable without ever doing anything you could point to. As the show developed, this concealed menace softened into something much stranger and more interesting. Ned became a man of profound faith whose faith was tested, continuously, by a world that rewarded Homer and punished him. That inversion, the good man losing and the chaotic man winning, became one of the show's richest ongoing dynamics. Fact 29. Krusty the Clown was originally designed to be Homer in disguise. This is a piece of Simpsons mythology that has circulated for years, and it is genuinely true. In an early conception of the show, Krusty was meant to be Homer's alter ego, a secret performer beneath the exterior of the bored nuclear plant worker. The idea was that Bart would be completely unable to see that his idol, the clown he worshipped, was actually his own father. This would have said something pointed about the way children mythologize celebrities and fail to see the human beings closest to them. The idea was eventually dropped because it complicated the storytelling machinery enormously. But the visual similarity between Homer and Krusty, their shared silhouette, their shared four-fingered hands, their similar proportions, was deliberately maintained as a vestige of this abandoned storyline. Fact 30. Sideshow Bob, played by Kelsey Grammer, was not originally conceived as a recurring character. He appeared in the Season 1 episode The Telltale Head and was designed as a one-time foil for Krusty. The character's unexpected depth, which came partly from the complexity Grammer brought to even the smallest vocal choices, convinced the producers that there was more to explore. Sideshow Bob became one of the show's most beloved recurring figures, a Shakespearean villain operating inside a cartoon comedy, a man of genuine culture and ambition, trapped in a cycle of Simpsons-related humiliation. Grammer has returned to the role so many times across so many decades that Bob's relationship with the show is now itself a kind of comedy, the joke of a tremendously accomplished actor lending his full gravity to a cartoon villain who keeps losing to an 11-year-old. Fact 31. Moe Szyslak's backstory has been rewritten more times than almost any other characters on the show. At various points across the series, Moe has been described as a former child actor, a former professional boxer, an immigrant from various different countries, a man with a genuinely tragic secret past, a former member of a barbershop quartet, a failed chef, and a person with connections to organized crime. None of these backstories are mutually exclusive technically, and the show has never bothered to establish a definitive canonical version. Moe's past is perpetually in flux, which is itself a kind of joke about how backstory functions in a show with a floating timeline. Moe is whoever he needs to be for the episode he is currently in. Fact 32. The character of Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon was the source of significant controversy in the show's later years, specifically following the release of a documentary called The Problem with Apu in 2017. The documentary raised questions about the character's portrayal of Indian Americans and the accent Hank Azaria had used to voice him for nearly 30 years. The Simpsons addressed this controversy within the show itself, in an episode that many critics found unsatisfying as a response. Azaria subsequently stepped down from the role. The show has handled Apu's presence sparingly since that point, though the character has not been written out. The episode in question is a genuinely interesting artifact of a show trying to respond to cultural criticism of itself in real time, struggling to find the right register for a conversation that the half-hour comedy format was not really designed to accommodate. Fact 33. Principal Skinner's character was partly inspired by a real type that Groening observed during his own schooling. The pedantic, frustrated administrator who once had large ambitions and ended up in a position that offers very little outlet for them. Skinner's dynamic with Superintendent Chalmers is one of the show's most reliably funny recurring relationships, built on a specific kind of institutional cowardice that Skinner displays in Chalmers's presence. He is a different person around Chalmers than he is in his own office. He inflates his claims, minimizes disasters, presents Springfield Elementary as a functioning school in the face of overwhelming evidence that it is not. The dynamic works because it is recognizable. Almost everyone has witnessed some version of this relationship between a subordinate and a superior. Fact 34. Chief Wiggum was based partly on a real style of American law enforcement that Groening and the early writers found absurd. The cheerful, slightly corrupt small-town cop who is not malicious, just lazy and incompetent. Wiggum is not a villain in any meaningful sense. He is simply not very good at the job he has been given, and he has been given a job with significant power over other people's lives. The gap between the authority he wields and the capability he brings to wielding it is the engine of the joke. Hank Azaria's voice, that slightly wheezing, good-natured tone, gives Wiggum a quality of someone who is genuinely unaware of how bad he is at this, which makes him funnier and less threatening than a more self-aware version of the character would be. Fact 35. The comic book guy, whose actual name was eventually revealed to be Jeff Albertson after years of anonymity, was based on a specific type that Groening and the writers encountered repeatedly in the world of comic book retail. The opinionated, deeply knowledgeable, slightly contemptuous specialist who has organized his entire life around a particular fandom and who uses that expertise as a social barrier rather than a social bridge. The character became enormously popular partly because the internet age created more contexts in which this personality type appeared and became recognizable to a broader audience. Comic Book Guy is funnier in 2025 than he was in 1992 because the conditions that produce him have proliferated. Fact 36. Patty and Selma Bouvier, Marge's twin sisters, were deliberately designed as a kind of nightmare vision of what Marge's life might have been if she had made different choices. They are the version of Marge who never found someone to love her, who channeled their disappointment into cigarettes and a shared apartment and a job at the Department of Motor Vehicles and a devotion to a fictional actor named MacGyver. They are profoundly sad characters underneath the comedy. Their cruelty toward Homer is not random. It is the cruelty of people who see in Homer everything that went wrong in their own lives, and they resent Marge for getting something they didn't. Fact 37. Dr. Nick Riviera, Springfield's dangerously incompetent physician, was originally intended as a single-episode character who would not return. His catchphrase, "Hi everybody," and the audience response, "Hi Dr. Nick," were not planned as running gags. They emerged from the voice performance and the audience reaction and the writer's recognition that there was something so economically funny about a doctor who was this obviously unqualified that the show would be poorer without the option to return to him. Dr. Nick became one of the show's most reliably amusing background characters, a walking visual joke about the consequences of inadequate healthcare. Fact 38. The character of Lionel Hutz, the comically inept attorney voiced by the late Phil Hartman, was one of the show's most beloved recurring figures. After Hartman's tragic death in 1998, the producers made the decision not to recast the role. This was a genuine tribute to Hartman's irreplaceability, but it also permanently removed from the show a character who had been a significant comedic resource for nearly a decade. Phil Hartman also voiced the character of Troy McClure, the washed-up actor who had appeared in fictional films with titles no one could plausibly make up. Both characters vanished from Springfield with Hartman's passing, and their absence is something longtime fans feel in a specific, quiet way whenever the show visits a courtroom or a television screen. Fact 39. Sideshow Mel, the character who replaced Sideshow Bob as Krusty's on-air sidekick, is consistently one of the most elaborately designed background characters in the show. His bone-through-the-hair visual design is absurd and inexplicable within the logic of the show's world, which is precisely the joke. He is voiced by Dan Castellaneta, which means Homer and Sideshow Mel share a voice actor, a fact that has occasionally been played with in episodes where the two characters interact in ways that highlight their uncanny acoustic similarity. Fact 40. Ralph Wiggum, Chief Wiggum's son, started out as essentially a background character whose only function was to occupy space in classroom scenes. He was not given distinctive dialogue in his earliest appearances. The character's voice, that slightly dreamy, disconnected quality, and his habit of saying things that are simultaneously innocent and deeply unsettling, developed gradually as writers discovered that Ralph was a comedic goldmine. His non-sequiturs are among the most quoted lines in the show's history. "I choose you" with its heart-shaped card became a cultural artifact. "My cat's breath smells like cat food" was a joke so perfect it became a reference point for a certain kind of absurdist observation. Ralph Wiggum, the child who was almost a piece of furniture, became one of the show's most reliably funny inventions. Fact 41. Otto Mann, the school bus driver, was originally pitched as a more dangerous character. Less the cheerful, good-natured stoner who barely maintains the bus route, and more an actively hazardous presence behind the wheel of a vehicle carrying children. The show pulled back from the darker version because it found something more interesting in Otto's genuine enthusiasm for life. Otto is happy. He is spectacularly irresponsible in many ways, but his happiness is not a pose. He loves music. He loves his bus. He loves the kids in a vague, unfocused way. He is the embodiment of someone who has found a level of contentment that the more ambitious residents of Springfield never achieve, and he has achieved it by caring very little about the things they care so much about. Fact 42. Groundskeeper Willie was originally conceived as a Scottish-American character, a person of Scottish descent who had been raised in America and retained some cultural connection to his heritage. He became fully Scottish, speaking in a thick accent and steeped in Scottish pride, through a process that the writers describe as the character finding himself. The more Scottish Willie became, the funnier he became. His contempt for France became a running joke. His unexpected athleticism, the way he can transform from a maintenance worker into a kind of superhuman force of nature when sufficiently motivated, became one of the show's most reliable visual gags. Lauren Bouchard, who would later create Bob's Burgers, worked on The Simpsons during a period when Willie was being developed into his finished form. Fact 43. Professor Frink, the show's resident mad scientist, is loosely based on Jerry Lewis. More specifically, he is based on Jerry Lewis as the Nutty Professor, that particular performance of brilliant, slightly unhinged academic energy that Lewis perfected in the 1960s. Hank Azaria modeled the vocal quality directly on Lewis, that nasal, stuttering, excitement-driven delivery that sounds like someone whose thoughts are moving faster than their mouth can keep up with. Frank has been one of the show's most flexible characters in terms of what the plot needs him to do, because a mad scientist can credibly appear in almost any Springfield storyline and provide whatever technical explanation the plot requires. Fact 44. Itchy and Scratchy, the ultra-violent cartoon that Bart and Lisa watch within The Simpsons, is a parody of Tom and Jerry, but it is also a deliberate meta-commentary on the history of animation censorship in America. Itchy and Scratchy's violence is so cartoonishly extreme, so far beyond what any real children's program would permit, that it became the show's way of satirizing both the violence in entertainment and the pearl-clutching response to that violence. The episodes of Itchy and Scratchy that appear within The Simpsons are carefully crafted to be genuinely funny as cartoons, while also being completely over the top. The recurring character Poochie, the focus group manufactured character added to the Itchy and Scratchy cast in a famous episode, is one of the sharpest pieces of television criticism the show has ever produced. A perfect skewering of network interference in creative production. Number. Section 3. The Writer's Room Secrets. Facts 45 through 66. The Simpsons has employed more talented writers over its run than almost any other television series in history. At its peak, the writing staff included multiple Harvard-educated mathematicians, published novelists, stand-up comedians, and at least one person who would go on to win a Nobel Prize. The culture of the writer's room, the way it operated, the traditions it established, the disasters it narrowly avoided, and the occasional masterpieces it produced by accident, is one of the most interesting stories in American television. Here is some of what went on behind that door. Fact 45. The Simpsons writer's room in the early 90s operated on a principle of ruthless meritocracy that the show's early veterans describe as both exhilarating and terrifying. A joke had to earn its place in the room. It was not enough to pitch something funny. The room would test a joke, riff on it, find every possible variation, push it in new directions, and then decide whether the original version or one of the variants was better. This process produced incredibly tight material. It also produced a culture in which writers were constantly pushing to outdo each other, constantly raising the bar, constantly trying to write the thing that the room had not seen coming. The competitive energy of that room is widely credited with the remarkable density of the show's golden age. Those seasons roughly from 4 through 8, where the show seems to operate at a comic frequency that has rarely been matched in television. Fact 46. The show famously has a culture of writing jokes in multiples. Rather than writing one punchline and moving on, the writer's room would generate 5 or 6 or 7 different versions of the same joke and then choose the best one. This system meant that for every joke you hear in a finished episode, there are several other versions that were considered and discarded. Some of those discarded jokes were almost as good as the ones that made it. Some were better. The process of choosing between good jokes is, paradoxically, one of the hardest things a comedy writer's room does, because there is no objective standard for funnier. It comes down to taste, to timing, to a collective sense of what the show is. Fact 47. John Swartzwelder, who wrote 59 episodes of The Simpsons, more than any other single writer, is one of the most celebrated and most mysterious figures in the history of television comedy. He was known within the writer's room for an eccentric working method that involved writing at home rather than coming into the office, which was unusual even then. He apparently wrote his scripts in diner booths over long stretches of time, nursing coffee, filling yellow legal pads with material, and then eventually producing finished scripts that the room would receive with something between admiration and bewilderment. Swartzwelder left The Simpsons around the end of the show's 13th season and has given almost no interviews since. He has spent the subsequent decades writing a series of detective novels set in a surreal, retro-American world, which have a devoted following among Simpsons fans. He is one of the most influential comedy writers of the 20th century, and almost no one knows what he looks like. Fact 48. Many of the show's best-remembered jokes were not written by a single person, but emerged from the collaborative momentum of the room. The writer's room format, where multiple people are talking simultaneously, riffing on each other's ideas, finishing each other's thoughts, produces jokes that no single individual could claim full authorship of. This creates an interesting attribution problem. When fans ask who wrote a particular famous joke, the honest answer is often several people, building on each other at a particular moment in a room that doesn't exist anymore. The Simpsons is less a collection of individual voices than it is a record of what happens when a specific group of people are in a specific room together at a specific moment in television history. Fact 49. The show has a tradition called the table read, where the cast assembles to read a new script aloud before it goes into production. Table reads serve multiple purposes. They give the writers a chance to hear whether the jokes land, whether the pacing works, whether a performance is pushing the material in a direction that changes how it reads on the page. Table reads have saved episodes that looked mediocre on paper and revealed problems in episodes that looked brilliant on paper. The acoustic experience of the script, the way it sounds when actual voices bring it to life, is genuinely different from the visual experience of reading it. Fact 50. Writers on The Simpsons have occasionally written themselves into episodes, not always literally, but conceptually. There is a tradition of the show's writers using the material to process their own anxieties, their own frustrations, their own experiences of being intelligent people working in a medium that sometimes did not reward intelligence. Lisa Simpson is often described by former writers as a vessel for their own feelings about being the smartest person in a room that doesn't care. Homer is described as a vehicle for their own self-sabotaging impulses, their own capacity to make obviously bad decisions while knowing perfectly well that they are bad decisions. Fact 51. The show has a no hugging, no learning rule that was articulated by early showrunner Mike Reiss. The rule states that the characters should not learn meaningful lessons from their experiences and should not become measurably better people as a result of the episodes they are in. This was a deliberate choice to distinguish The Simpsons from the family sitcom tradition, in which episodes typically ended with a moment of character growth, a lesson learned, a relationship deepened. The Simpsons decided to resist that structure. Characters would experience things, and then they would reset to their default state unchanged. This rule has been both celebrated and criticized over the years. In the early seasons, it produced comedy with genuine teeth, characters whose flaws were permanent and therefore funnier than flaws that could be resolved. In later seasons, some critics argue the rule has been applied too rigidly, preventing the show from accessing the emotional depth that its best episodes demonstrated it was capable of reaching. Fact 52. The writer's room produced a document in the show's early years called The Bart Book, which was a detailed character guide for Bart Simpson intended to help new writers understand who he was and what he would and would not do. The Bart book contains specific restrictions on Bart's behavior, things the show would not have him do even for comedic purposes, lines he would not cross even when the joke might be funnier if he crossed them. The existence of this document reflects a particular anxiety of the show's early success. Bart mania was real, Bart merchandise was everywhere, and the producers were acutely aware that Bart was being absorbed into American culture in a way that came with responsibilities. They wanted to control the character's image carefully, to make sure that the Bart, who appeared on t-shirts and lunchboxes, was not someone parents would find genuinely objectionable. Fact 53. The process of getting a guest star to appear on The Simpsons involves a specific set of negotiations that have evolved significantly over the show's history. In the early years, the guest stars who appeared on the show were often genuinely excited to be there, arrived with enthusiasm, and were willing to do multiple takes and try different interpretations of their lines. As the show's reputation grew and the roster of famous names expanded, the process became more varied. Some celebrities arrive having studied the script and the character they are voicing and bring genuine preparation. Others arrive with minimal preparation and essentially read the lines as written. The difference between a great Simpsons guest appearance and a flat one often has less to do with how famous the guest is and more to do with how much they engaged with the material before they got to the booth. Fact 54. Many of the show's most beloved episodes were written in a state of genuine crisis. The production schedule for The Simpsons is famously brutal. Episodes go through multiple drafts in rapid succession. Scripts that are scheduled for production are sometimes barely finished when recording begins. The writing and the production run simultaneously in a way that would be alarming to anyone outside the television industry. Some writers describe the experience of working on The Simpsons as feeling like you are perpetually 2 days from catastrophe, always running, always late, always trying to finish the thing that was supposed to be finished last week. And yet somehow, out of this chaos, the show produced material that felt effortless, polished, and inevitable. The pressure may have been part of what made it work. Fact 55. The show's transition between showrunners is one of the defining features of its history. The Simpsons has had more than 20 showrunners over its run, a rate of turnover that is extraordinary even by the standards of long-running television. Each showrunner has left a distinct fingerprint on the seasons they oversaw. Fans who love the show can often identify the era of an episode from its tone, its structure, and the kinds of jokes it makes, even without checking the production credits. The transition from the early 90s era, defined by Al Jean, Mike Reiss, and eventually the remarkable run of Mike Scully and then Al Jean's return, tracks the show's evolution in ways that are genuinely visible on screen. Fact 56. Al Jean, who has been showrunner of The Simpsons since the 13th season, holds the record for the longest continuous tenure in that position in the show's history. His era encompasses more episodes than any previous showrunners, which means he has been responsible for more Simpsons than anyone else, by a significant margin. The relationship between fans and the Jean era is complicated. He has overseen some of the show's most creative late-period experiments, including the full-length episode shot in a continuous take and various format innovations. He has also overseen a period that many fans describe as the show's creative decline, a flattening of the emotional texture that characterized the first decade. Jean himself has been thoughtful in interviews about the challenges of maintaining a show's quality across such an extended run. Fact 57. The writer's room uses a pitching system that is different from many other shows. Writers pitch story ideas, not just jokes. The room then decides which stories are worth pursuing and assigns writers to develop them. A writer might pitch an idea, have it accepted, develop an outline, have the outline reworked in the room, write a first draft, have the first draft rewritten in the room, and then see the finished script go through additional passes before it reaches the recording stage. By the time an episode airs, the original writer's contribution may be almost unrecognizable, blended into the collective voice of the room. This is sometimes frustrating for individual writers. It is also arguably what made the show so consistently excellent in its peak years, because the quality control function of the room's collective voice caught problems that an individual writer might not see in their own material. Fact 58. Several Simpsons writers went on to create their own extraordinarily successful shows. Conan O'Brien, who wrote for the show from Season 3 through Season 5, went on to host Late Night with Conan O'Brien. Greg Daniels co-created King of the Hill and later adapted The Office for American television. Seth MacFarlane, who worked on the show in a more peripheral capacity, created Family Guy. Brad Bird, who directed Camp Krusty and other episodes, went on to direct The Incredibles and Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. The writer's room of The Simpsons in its peak years was essentially a graduate school for American comedy, producing graduates who went on to define the medium. Fact 59. The show has a tradition of hiding non-sequitur background jokes and scenes that the main plot does not draw attention to. These are jokes that exist entirely in the background, visible if you are looking but never commented upon by the characters in the foreground. A sign outside a building. A newspaper headline visible for a single frame. A book title on a shelf. The show's animators and writers have been inserting these visual jokes into every episode for the show's entire run, and dedicated fans have spent decades cataloging them. Some of these background jokes are among the sharpest and funniest in the show's history. They are rewards for attentive viewers. Fact 60. The writer's room has a list of things that are permanently off-limits for the show. Not just off-limits for now, but genuinely untouchable topics or scenarios that the room has decided cross lines it is not interested in crossing, for various reasons ranging from genuine ethical concern to a sense that some jokes are simply not worth the attention they would bring. This list has evolved over the years as the culture around the show and around comedy more broadly has changed. Some things that were once considered fine became problems. Some things that once seemed problematic became more tractable. The list is not public, but its existence is confirmed by former writers who describe it as a surprisingly useful creative constraint. Fact 61. The show developed a specific convention for how Springfield's geography is handled by the writing staff. When a new story requires a location that has not previously been established, the writer simply invents it. Springfield's geography expands to accommodate whatever the story needs. A harbor when the story needs a harbor. A desert when the story needs a desert. Mountains when the story needs mountains. The writers maintain a loose internal map that is deliberately left underdetermined, and the unspoken rule is that contradictions between different episodes' versions of the map are simply ignored. This is not laziness. It is a conscious decision to keep the town flexible, to refuse to let geographical specificity limit the kinds of stories the show can tell. Fact 62. The writers have used the show, at various points, to settle personal scores with specific targets, not in a vindictive way, but in the sense that a particularly sharp satire of, say, the entertainment industry or a specific type of cultural figure often has a real-world origin in something that annoyed someone in the room. The show's send-ups of network television, of studio executives, of critics, of focus groups and test audiences are often identifiable by former staff as responses to specific real-world interactions. The Poochie episode, which savages the process of focus group-driven character creation, was written during a period when the production was receiving more network notes than usual. It is a comedy about creative interference, written by people experiencing creative interference, which gives it a sharpness that transcends pure satire. Fact 63. One of the show's long-running behind-the-scenes jokes involves the enormous stack of rejected scripts that accumulates over every season. Scripts that were developed to varying degrees of completion and then abandoned for reasons ranging from "the story didn't work" to "we made a better version of this 3 seasons ago" to simply "we ran out of." Some of these abandoned scripts are reportedly excellent. Some have been partially recycled, with individual scenes or jokes extracted and placed into different episodes. The graveyard of never-made Simpsons is one of television's most interesting hypothetical archives. Fact 64. The show has a tradition of the cold open, a brief scene that plays before the title sequence and is typically unconnected to the main plot of the episode. The cold open was not part of the show's original format. It developed as the show expanded its storytelling vocabulary and as the writers found they needed more space to establish premises, introduce guest characters, or simply tell an additional small story that would not fit into the episode's main narrative. Some of the show's most memorable moments are cold opens that exist in isolation, not connected to anything else, just a pure, self-contained comedic idea executed in a minute or two. Fact 65. Season 8 of The Simpsons contains what many dedicated fans and critics consider to be the single greatest episode in the show's history, Homer's Enemy, in which a new hire at the plant named Frank Grimes encounters Homer and is driven to psychological collapse by the injustice of Homer's comfortable, successful life, is a piece of television that deliberately tests the limits of the show's format. Grimes is a realistic human being dropped into Springfield's cartoonish reality, and the collision destroys him. The episode ends badly. No reset, no lesson. Just Frank Grimes dead and Homer asleep at the funeral. It is a genuinely dark piece of work for a comedy, and the writers have described it as something they were never entirely sure they would be allowed to do. Fact 66. The episode 22 short films about Springfield, which aired in Season 7, was inspired by the film Pulp Fiction and its non-linear anthology structure. The episode takes the form of a series of short vignettes, each focused on a different secondary Springfield character, exploring their lives on a single afternoon in a way that the episode's normal format never allowed. The episode required an unusual degree of coordination between writing staff members, each of whom took responsibility for specific segments. It remains one of the most formally inventive episodes in the show's history and demonstrated that the show was capable of radical structural experimentation without losing its essential character. Number. Section 4. The hidden details in plain sight. Fact 67. Through 88. Every episode of The Simpsons contains more information than you can absorb in a single viewing. This is intentional. The show was designed from its earliest seasons to reward repeated viewing, to plant details and backgrounds and margins and incidental dialogue that would not register on first pass, but would reveal themselves on return. Some of these hidden details are jokes. Some are continuity references. Some are pieces of mythology that the show is building without drawing attention to. And some are genuinely strange artifacts of the production process that ended up on screen by accident and have taken on lives of their own in the decades since. Here are the ones worth knowing. Fact 67. The books visible on Lisa's bookshelf change from episode to episode but always contain references to real literature. Careful viewers over the years have identified titles ranging from actual children's classics to adult literary fiction to philosophical texts that no 8-year-old would plausibly own. The selection of Lisa's books is one of the places where the show's writing staff inserts their own reading interests and intellectual enthusiasms. The bookshelf is never a focal point of any scene. It is purely background information, but it has been consistently populated with real titles throughout the show's run. Fact 68. The Simpson family's kitchen refrigerator has been used as a visual joke delivery mechanism across dozens of episodes. Drawings, shopping lists, notes, and photographs affixed to the refrigerator door change episode to episode and are designed to be paused and read. The contents of the refrigerator door are one of the show's most reliably populated areas of background gag density. Animators have described spending significant time on the refrigerator, specifically because they know that dedicated fans will freeze frame and examine it. Fact 69. The power plant's break room, where Homer and his colleagues spend much of their working day, contains a whiteboard that is populated with equations in some episodes. In one memorable instance, the equation visible on the whiteboard was a real, unsolved mathematical problem. The show has never confirmed whether this was intentional or whether someone on the art team simply included an interesting equation without realizing its status. The mathematical community noticed, and it generated a brief period of genuine puzzlement as people tried to figure out whether the show was making a specific reference or whether it was simply decoration. Fact 70. Bart's treehouse, which appears in multiple episodes, has an inconsistent design that changes depending on which episode it appears in. The treehouse has been in different trees, at different heights, with different interior layouts, sometimes containing a ladder, sometimes not, sometimes appearing weathered and old, sometimes appearing recently built. The inconsistency is so pronounced that dedicated fans have created diagrams attempting to map all the different versions of the treehouse across the show's history. The most charitable explanation is continuity drift across decades of production. The most entertaining explanation is that Bart has rebuilt it multiple times. Fact 71. The Flanders house next door to The Simpsons has been used as a visual contrast device throughout the show. When the show wants to establish that something about The Simpsons is substandard, the camera will occasionally cut to the equivalent thing in the Flanders house for comparison. The Flanders kitchen is visibly cleaner. The Flanders yard is visibly better maintained. The Flanders children are visibly more under control. This visual comparison technique is understated but consistent, and it does real work in establishing the specific nature of the gap between Homer's life and the life next door. Fact 72. The show has buried references to specific works of literature and film in episode titles so densely that there are fan wikis dedicated solely to tracking down the sources. Almost every episode title in the show's history references something specific: a film, a book, a song, a famous phrase. Some of these references are immediate and obvious. Homer at the Bat references Casey at the Bat, the famous baseball poem. Bart Sells His Soul is a very slight reworking of Faust. Others are more obscure. The title King Size Homer plays on the novel King Size Canary in a way that most viewers never register. The episode title writing is itself a form of intellectual entertainment layered over the more visible comedy. Fact 73. The town of Springfield contains a significant number of businesses that appear in the background of episodes and are never visited or referenced in the main plot. Over the years, fans have cataloged these background businesses with the dedication of urban historians. Some of these businesses appear for a single episode and are never seen again. Others persist across decades of the show as consistent background presences in Springfield's commercial district. The names of these businesses are frequently jokes that only become visible if you pause the episode, which means they are essentially jokes for people watching on home video or streaming platforms rather than for the original broadcast audience. Fact 74. Springfield Elementary has a consistently changing student population in the background. The recurring background students who populate Bart's classroom have been given names, backstories, and even small speaking roles by the writing staff in various episodes. Some of these background students have become beloved in their own right. Database, the bespectacled student with a passion for computers, has appeared in enough episodes to be considered a recurring character. Jimbo Jones and Kearney Zizigwitz, two of Bart's regular bullies, have interior lives that the show has sketched across multiple episodes in ways that add a specific pathos to characters who are primarily comedic threats. Fact 75. The Simpsons has a history of hiding mathematical jokes that are genuinely sophisticated. The most famous example involves an episode in which Homer Simpson writes an equation on a blackboard. A mathematician who reviewed the episode calculated that the equation Homer had written was, in fact, a near-miss solution to Fermat's last theorem, one of the most famous problems in mathematics history. The equation predates the actual proof of Fermat's last theorem and describes a number that is not technically a counterexample to the theorem, but that appears to be one if you round it. This joke was inserted into the episode by a writer with a mathematics background, and it is the kind of joke that is genuinely funny only to a very small number of people, but is extraordinary in its specificity and sophistication. Fact 76. The school cafeteria at Springfield Elementary serves food that changes from episode to episode and has occasionally been rendered in a way that makes it look genuinely threatening. The cafeteria is one of those background locations that the animators have used as a canvas for visual humor that the main characters never acknowledge. Dishes with unclear ingredients. Colors that suggest things that food should not be. Lunch ladies operating with a cheerful disregard for any principle of nutrition. The cafeteria, in its background detail, is a portrait of institutional food service that is sharper than anything the main plot ever says about it. Fact 77. The Quickie Mart has a consistent inventory that fans have cataloged across episodes. Certain products appear repeatedly on the shelves. Krusty-branded items show up with remarkable frequency, reflecting the in-universe ubiquity of the Krusty the Clown entertainment brand. Some products on the Quickie Mart shelves are recurring jokes that persist across years of episodes. The squishy machine, the rotating hot dog carousel, the specific arrangement of beer cases behind the counter. The Quickie Mart is one of Springfield's most consistent visual environments, and its consistency is a product of deliberate attention by the show's art department. Fact 78. Moe's Tavern has a specific telephone number that has been referenced in multiple episodes. The number is BR5492. In some episodes, the area code before this number changes, but the core number remains consistent. The show has occasionally played with this number as a joke, having it appear in unexpected contexts or having characters dial it in situations where calling a bar would be an obviously bad idea. The phone number of Moe's Tavern is one of those pieces of Springfield geography that the show established early and has maintained as a consistent detail across decades. Fact 79. The Springfield Gorge, which appears in the famous sequence where Homer attempts to jump it on a skateboard in the episode Bart the Daredevil, was animated with a specific depth calculation. The art team apparently worked out the actual physics of the jump based on Homer's weight and the estimated distance of the gorge, and the result, Homer failing the jump and then tumbling down the gorge and being helicoptered back up only to fall again, is physically plausible, given those parameters. This is the kind of detail that no viewer would ever notice, but that reflects the specific kind of obsessive precision that the show's production team brought to even the most absurd sequences. Fact 80. The couch in the Simpson living room has been destroyed, rebuilt, replaced, and fundamentally altered in the couch gags hundreds of times without any acknowledgement within the show's main narrative. The couch itself, however, in the normal course of episodes, remains consistent in shape, color, and position. The couch gags are treated as a separate reality from the show's continuous world. No one in Springfield seems aware that their couch is subjected to weekly catastrophe and weekly resurrection. The couch is the show's most resilient object and its most thoroughly abused. Fact 81. The Simpsons has a very specific color palette for each location in Springfield, and these palettes have been maintained with remarkable consistency across decades of production and across multiple different animation studios. The warm, slightly washed-out tones of the Simpson house, the cool institutional greens of Springfield Elementary, the dim, amber-lit interior of Moe's Tavern, the harsh fluorescence of the power plant control room. These color environments were established early in the show's run and have been treated as canonical visual information by every art department that has worked on the show since. Fact 82. The show has hidden specific visual callbacks to earlier episodes and later ones, references that are visible only to viewers who remember the specific episode being referenced. These callbacks function as rewards for dedicated long-term viewers. A prop from a famous episode reappears in a character's background years later. A painting that appeared in one episode turns up in a completely different character's home in another. The show is full of these small continuity gifts placed there for the minority of viewers who would catch them. Fact 83. Springfield's town hall has been depicted with varying levels of grandeur across the show's history, sometimes appearing as an impressive civic building and sometimes as something barely distinguishable from a converted house. The inconsistency of the town hall's appearance is frequently cited as one of the show's less deliberate continuity errors, but it has also been argued that the town hall's shifting appearance reflects the varying levels of civic ambition that Springfield's residents project onto their institutions. Fact 84. The episode commentary tracks on the show's DVD releases contain a significant amount of information about the hidden details and background jokes that the commentary speakers specifically want to draw attention to. These commentary tracks are among the most information-dense documentary resources about the show's production that exist. They are also genuinely funny in themselves, featuring writers and producers who are clearly enjoying the opportunity to finally explain references that they assumed would go unnoticed. Some of the hidden jokes that the commentary speakers are most proud of are ones that almost no viewer ever caught during the original broadcast. Fact 85. The Simpson family car has been described at various points as multiple different makes and models. It is consistently depicted as an old, dirty, battered vehicle in poor mechanical condition, but the specific year and model has varied. In some episodes, it is described as a vehicle from the 1970s. In others, context suggests it is considerably older. Homer's relationship with the car is one of ambivalent attachment. He treats it poorly but relies on it completely, which is essentially his relationship with most of the things in his life. Fact 86. The show has repeatedly depicted Springfield's newspaper, the Springfield Shopper, with headlines that are jokes visible only to viewers willing to pause the episode. The Shopper's front page is one of the show's most reliably populated areas of background comedy. Headlines have ranged from commentary on Springfield's local politics to absurdist observations about the town's general state of dysfunction to direct parodies of real-world news stories that were current at the time of production. The Shopper is Springfield's newspaper of record, and its record is deeply strange. Fact 87. The various churches, temples, and places of worship in Springfield have been used as visual comedy resources across the show's history. The First Church of Springfield, where Ned Flanders worships and Homer occasionally sleeps, has a specific interior design that the show has maintained consistently. The congregation is always depicted as slightly bored, slightly distracted, and occasionally hostile to the sermons being delivered. The minister, Reverend Lovejoy, is one of the show's most consistently deployed minor characters, a man whose faith has been so thoroughly depleted by the demands of his congregation that he has become a kind of spiritual civil servant, going through the motions with the efficiency of someone who has stopped expecting the motions to mean anything. Fact 88. The episode Homer's Phobia, which features a gay character played by John Waters and deals explicitly with Homer's discomfort around homosexuality, was produced in the show's 8th season and won a GLAAD Media Award for its handling of the subject matter. But it is worth noting that the episode was rejected by the network once before being eventually approved. The initial rejection cited concerns about the subject matter. The eventual approval came after a period of negotiation. The episode that was finally produced is considered one of the show's best, and the fact that it almost did not exist is a reminder of how many creative decisions in television are shaped by institutional anxiety about audience response. Number. Section 5. The guest stars and what they left behind. Facts 89 through 110. The Simpsons has hosted more famous people in guest roles than virtually any other television series in history. Presidents, Nobel laureates, rock stars, athletes, film directors, fashion designers, philosophers, and at least one person who is famous primarily for being famous. The guest star list is itself a document of the show's remarkable cultural reach, evidence that for a significant period of American cultural history, appearing on The Simpsons was considered one of the most desirable cameo opportunities in entertainment. But what happened in those recording sessions, what the guests brought with them and what they took away, and what the show did with their presence, is a story that is more varied and more interesting than the credit sequence suggests. Fact 89. Michael Jackson appeared in the Season 3 premiere Stark Raving Dad and was listed in the credits as John J. Smith. Jackson called Matt Groening personally to ask for the role, and Groening granted it without hesitation. Jackson voiced a large white man named Leon Kompowski who claims to be Michael Jackson. The actual singing in the episode was performed by a Michael Jackson sound-alike, as Jackson only spoke the dialogue, not the musical portions. Jackson was reportedly delighted with the episode and considered it one of his favorite professional experiences of that period. The episode was later pulled from circulation by the production company following the documentary that revisited allegations against Jackson, which means Stark Raving Dad is now one of the few Simpsons episodes that has been officially removed from the streaming library. Fact 90. Elizabeth Taylor voiced Maggie Simpson's first word, Daddy, in the episode Lisa's First Word. The decision to use Taylor for this cameo was partly a joke. Casting one of the most famous voices in Hollywood to say a single word in a cartoon was an example of the show's delight in disproportion. The idea that the grandest possible approach to a tiny comedic moment is itself the comedy. Taylor was reportedly amused by the assignment and completed it without complaint. The word daddy was recorded multiple times in different registers, and the production team selected the version that felt most like a genuine moment of a child discovering language. Fact 91. Dustin Hoffman appeared in the Season 2 episode Lisa's Substitute and was listed in the credits as Sam Edick, an anagram of the word semantic. His character, Mr. Bergstrom, is a substitute teacher who profoundly affects Lisa and then leaves, which is one of the show's most emotionally resonant single-episode stories. Hoffman brought such genuine warmth and specificity to the role that the episode transcends its one-episode premise and becomes something that viewers remember for years after watching it. Hoffman reportedly worked closely with the producers to develop the character, treating it with the same care he would bring to a major film role. Fact 92. Stephen Hawking appeared in multiple episodes of The Simpsons over the years and was one of the show's most enthusiastic repeat guests. Hawking reportedly genuinely enjoyed the show and found particular pleasure in the way his episodes allowed him to display a comedic side that his scientific work did not accommodate. His appearances consistently involved some version of the joke that the world's most famous theoretical physicist was a devoted Simpsons fan who happened to live in Springfield. The warmth between Hawking and the show's production team was genuine, and his episodes are among the most warmly received guest appearances in the show's history. Fact 93. Paul McCartney's appearance in the Season 7 episode Lisa the Vegetarian came with a specific condition. McCartney and his wife Linda agreed to appear only if the episode's message about vegetarianism was presented seriously and consistently, and specifically if the show committed to having Lisa remain vegetarian in all future episodes. The show agreed, and Lisa has indeed remained a vegetarian for every episode since, making McCartney's cameo arguably the most consequential guest appearance in terms of its lasting effect on the show's continuity. This is the only known case in which a guest star's appearance condition produced a permanent change to a main character's characterization. Fact 94. Johnny Cash voiced a space coyote in the Season 8 episode El Viaje Misterioso de Nuestro Homer, which features Homer on a spiritual quest through a surreal desert landscape after eating extraordinarily spicy chili peppers. Cash recorded his lines in a single session and was reportedly moved by the material, which touches on questions of spiritual longing and the search for one's true purpose. The Cash Coyote is one of the show's most uncanny and beautiful guest appearances, partly because Cash's voice, that particular quality of depth and weight and lived experience, gives the coyote a gravity that makes Homer's vision quest feel genuinely meaningful rather than purely absurd. Fact 95. Rodney Dangerfield appeared in the Season 2 episode Dancin' Homer and brought what can only be described as his entire act with him. The production team has described the Dangerfield recording session as one of the most purely joyful they experienced in the early years of the show. Dangerfield was in his element. He arrived with alternative versions of nearly every line, jokes he had generated in preparation, observations about the character that sharpened the episode's comedy. The finished performance is a document of a great comedian doing exactly what he was built to do. Fact 96. U2 appeared in the Season 9 episode Trash of the Titans, and the recording session involved all 4 band members voicing themselves in a storyline that required them to actually play Springfield in a concert setting. The episode was a commentary on celebrity culture and municipal politics that the band engaged with gamely. Bono, in particular, has been cited as genuinely enthusiastic about the material and willing to lean into the self-satirizing aspects of the episode's premise. The Simpsons has always been most effective with musical guest stars, when the musicians are willing to acknowledge that the show is making fun of them. Fact 97. James Brown appeared in the show and left behind one of the stranger stories in the guest star archive. The session required multiple attempts to get Brown's lines to sync correctly with the animation, and the production team describes a process that was enthusiastic and chaotic in roughly equal measure. Brown brought his characteristic intensity to the recording booth, which was not entirely what the material required, and the results were adjusted in post-production in ways that the team found both challenging and ultimately satisfying. Fact 98. Winona Ryder voiced a character in a Season 5 episode that features an alternative, smarter, faster-paced version of Springfield, where all the smart kids go. The episode is partially a meditation on what happens when intelligence is given resources it normally lacks, and Ryder's character functions as a romantic interest for Bart that the episode uses to explore what Bart might be capable of in an environment that challenged him. The episode is one of several in which the show uses a guest character to illuminate something about a main character that the show's normal format cannot accommodate. Fact 99. Meryl Streep appeared in an episode in which she voiced Bart's love interest, a girl named Chloe, in what the show used as an opportunity to examine how class functions in Springfield. Streep brought a specific quality of intelligent warmth to the role that served the episode's more subtle emotional purposes. The production team has described Streep as one of the most prepared and precise guest performers they have ever worked with. Fact 100. The Ramones appeared in the Season 6 episode Rosebud and performed a birthday song for Mr. Burns. The joke is that Burns is furious because he wanted the real Ramones, who are standing right in front of him. The Ramones recorded their portion of the episode with genuine enthusiasm and reportedly spent part of the session doing multiple takes of the song simply because they were enjoying themselves. The sight of one of punk rock's most iconoclastic bands serenading a cartoon billionaire at his birthday party is precisely the kind of absurdist juxtaposition that The Simpsons does better than anyone. Fact 101. Leonard Nimoy appeared in multiple episodes over the years and seemed to genuinely enjoy the experience each time. His most famous appearance involves the monorail episode, in which he delivers an increasingly bizarre set of non-sequitur lines that the production team inserted partly to see if Nimoy would do anything they asked. He did everything they asked, with complete commitment and no apparent concern for his dignity. A performer who takes himself too seriously cannot play the Simpsons version of themselves effectively, and Nimoy demonstrated a capacity for self-deprecation that made him a perfect fit for the show's satirical sensibility. Fact 102. The Rolling Stones appeared in an episode that involved a storyline about rock and roll history and required Mick Jagger and Keith Richards to voice themselves in a situation where they are treated as relics of a past era. Both agreed to the self-deprecating premise, which is itself notable. The Stones were, at the time of recording, one of the most commercially successful touring acts in the world. Their willingness to appear in a cartoon that specifically jokes about their status as aging icons reflects a self-awareness that is not always associated with musicians of their stature. Fact 103. Patrick Stewart appeared in the Season 9 episode The Joy of Sect and played the leader of a cult called the Movementarians who takes over Springfield. Stewart's performance requires him to alternate between the calm authority that he brought to roles like Captain Picard and a barely concealed menace that the episode reveals as the cult's true nature. It is a study in controlled volatility that Stewart executed with remarkable precision. The episode itself is one of the show's better late-period satirical pieces, a genuinely sharp commentary on how cults recruit members and maintain control. Fact 104. John Lovitz appeared in the show more times than almost any other guest star. His recurring character Jay Sherman, a film critic borrowed from the short-lived series The Critic, was a particularly popular presence. Lovitz has described his relationship with the show as one of the most satisfying professional collaborations of his career. The writers found that Lovitz could take any line and make it funnier than it read on the page, a quality that makes a performer invaluable in the voice recording context, where the line between the written joke and the performed joke is everything. Fact 105. Danny DeVito appeared in the show voicing a character named Herbert Powell, who is eventually revealed to be Homer's long-lost half-brother. The episode is one of the show's most structurally elegant stories, a rise-and-fall narrative in which Homer is temporarily elevated to a social status he cannot handle and destroys his brother's business in the process. DeVito brought genuine warmth to Herbert, making the character's ultimate forgiveness of Homer feel earned rather than sentimental. It is one of the show's better examinations of what it actually means to care about someone whose limitations you fully understand. Fact 106. David Crosby appeared in an episode that required him to voice a character who is clearly a stand-in for a certain type of aging hippie who has made peace with having sold out. Crosby, who by that point in his life had some experience with this category of cultural observation, handled the material with equanimity. His session was reportedly brief and efficient, a single afternoon that produced exactly what the producers needed. Fact 107. The guest star who has surprised the production staff the most, by various accounts, is a figure who came in expecting to do a brief cameo and instead spent several hours with the cast and writers because they were simply having too good a time to leave. The specific identity of this person varies depending on which production staff member is telling the story, which suggests that this has happened more than once. Fact 108. The show has used guest stars in ways that range from the deeply integrated to the purely decorative. At its best, a Simpsons guest appearance uses the celebrity's specific persona, the cultural meaning of who they are, as material for the joke. The Ramones playing a birthday song are funny partly because of who the Ramones are. Hawking appearing as a Simpsons fan is funny partly because of who Hawking is. At its worst, a guest appearance simply has a famous person say their own name and deliver a few lines that could have been given to any character. The decline in the purposefulness of guest casting is one of the frequently cited markers of the show's later seasons. Fact 109. Several guest stars have described The Simpsons recording process as unlike any other voice work they have done. The combination of the established cast's chemistry, the speed of the direction, and the density of joke attempts per session creates an atmosphere that guests describe as both exhilarating and slightly difficult to keep up with. The regular cast members have been doing this for decades and can move through material very quickly. Guests who arrive prepared tend to have better sessions than guests who arrive expecting a more leisurely process. Fact 110. Johnny Carson, the television icon who hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years, appeared in the show in an episode and was one of the few guest stars who worked entirely without an audience reaction to calibrate his timing against. Voice recording is a strange medium for a comedian trained in performance, because the live feedback loop that comedy generally depends on is absent. Carson reportedly adapted to this almost immediately, demonstrating the deep professional competence of someone who had spent decades learning to read rooms of every possible configuration. Section 6. The episodes that almost destroyed the show. Facts 111 through 132. The history of The Simpsons contains a remarkable number of moments where the show came very close to not surviving. Controversies that threatened the network relationship. Episodes that came back from animation looking so bad that they almost didn't air. Creative decisions that divided the staff so severely that the working environment became toxic. Labor disputes that threatened to shut down production entirely. Feuds between cast members and producers. Creative crises that produced nothing for weeks. The fact that the show survived all of this and kept producing episodes is as much a story of institutional resilience as it is of creative genius. Fact 111. The first major production crisis in the show's history was the near-disastrous animation return on Some Enchanted Evening, the first episode intended for broadcast. When the finished animation arrived from the Klasky Kupo studio in South Korea, it was so far below the standard that the production team expected that the decision was made not to air it. The episode was sent back for a complete redo, which was extraordinarily expensive and time-consuming. The crisis revealed the fundamental difficulty of the show's offshore animation model, the communication gaps, the quality control challenges, the impossibility of closely supervising work being done on the other side of the world. The production team spent the next several seasons developing better systems for communicating their expectations to the animation studio, but the fundamental tension never fully resolved. Fact 112. In 1998, 3 of the show's main cast members, Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, and Nancy Cartwright, engaged in a contract renegotiation that threatened to stop production entirely. The actors were seeking higher per-episode fees and a share of merchandising revenue. The network and production company initially resisted. For a period of weeks, it was genuinely uncertain whether the show would continue. The standoff was resolved by an agreement that significantly increased the actors' compensation, but the negotiation left lasting tensions between the cast and production and established a template for future renegotiations that would play out in a similar way several more times across the show's history. Fact 113. The episode Homer Badman, which deals with a false accusation of sexual harassment against Homer, was produced during a period when the show was acutely aware of its cultural visibility and anxious about mishandling sensitive subject matter. The episode works partly as a satire of media hysteria and partly as a genuinely thoughtful examination of how accusations operate in a culture with a short attention span and a hunger for narratives. It was, at the time of its airing, one of the more culturally ambitious things the show had attempted, and it succeeded in ways that the production team describes as somewhat surprising, given how much uncertainty surrounded the project during its production. Fact 114. The Principal and the Pauper. The Season 9 episode that revealed Principal Skinner's true identity as Armin Tamzarian generated more negative audience response than almost any episode in the show's history. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner, publicly stated his unhappiness with the episode, which is remarkable given that actors on ongoing series rarely criticize their own show's creative choices in public. The episode has been consistently voted among the worst in the series by fans. The writers responsible for it have given varying accounts of how it came to be, with some defending it as a deliberate experiment with the show's format and others acknowledging that it did not work as intended. Fact 115. The Season 9 episode The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, in which Homer has a terrible experience trying to reclaim his car from Lower Manhattan, was pulled from syndication following the September 11th attacks and was not restored to the rotation for several years. The episode's imagery, which includes jokes about the World Trade Center, became too painful to broadcast in the aftermath of the attacks. This was not a decision that required much deliberation. The production team and the network agreed immediately that the episode was inappropriate to air in the post-attack cultural environment. The episode eventually returned to circulation but carries a specific historical weight that it did not have before. Fact 116. In 2004, the main cast engaged in another significant contract renegotiation. This negotiation reached a point where Fox announced it was considering replacing the main voice cast with other actors. The threat was apparently genuine enough that it produced serious alarm within the production. The resolution came through an agreement that made the main cast among the highest-paid performers in television at the time. The question of whether the show could survive a complete cast replacement is one that has been debated since. The consensus within the fan community is probably not, which is itself an interesting statement about how completely the voices have merged with the characters in the audience's imagination. Fact 117. A 2011 contract dispute between Harry Shearer and the show's production company almost resulted in Shearer leaving permanently. Shearer's demands included the right to work on other projects simultaneously, a restriction that the production had previously imposed on its performers. The dispute was eventually resolved, but for a period of several months, it was genuinely unclear whether Shearer would return. The prospect of Simpsons episodes without Mr. Burns, Ned Flanders, Principal Skinner, Kent Brockman, and all the other characters that Shearer voices was sufficiently alarming to motivate a resolution. Fact 118. The show has produced several episodes that the production team describes as having been broken in the writing process. A broken episode is one in which the story's central premise is fundamentally flawed in a way that only becomes apparent deep into production after significant resources have already been committed. The response to a broken episode is either to fix the premise, which often means throwing out large amounts of completed work, or to acknowledge the problem and move forward anyway, hoping that strong jokes can compensate for structural weakness. Some of the show's less successful episodes are broken episodes that were pushed through rather than fixed. Fact 119. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007, was in development for nearly 2 decades before it was finally made. The project had been discussed since the show's first season, when its success made a theatrical release seem like an obvious opportunity. The reasons it kept being delayed are various. The production team was always too busy with the series to commit to the movie. The story never felt fully developed enough to justify a theatrical release. There were concerns about how to make a Simpsons film feel special and distinct from a long episode. The movie eventually emerged from a period of intensive development that involved multiple versions of the story and required the writing staff to essentially produce a film's worth of material on top of their regular episode workload. The result was a commercially successful film that many fans consider a solid but not extraordinary example of what the show could do when given a larger canvas. Fact 120. There was a period in the show's middle seasons where the production schedule became so strained that the quality control process, the multiple rounds of review and revision that had characterized the Golden Age, was effectively abbreviated. Episodes were being finished closer to their air dates, leaving less time for the kind of iterative improvement that had produced the show's best work. Former writers described this period as one where you could feel the difference between what the show was capable of and what the schedule allowed it to produce. The episodes from this period are not uniformly bad, but they lack the density and precision of the earlier work, and the reason is partly that they were made faster, with less room for the collaborative refining process that made the early material so excellent. Fact 121. The relationship between the show and Fox's Standards and Practices Department, the network's internal censors, was a recurring source of creative conflict across the show's history. The show consistently tested the limits of what was permissible on network television, and the results were mixed. Some things the show wanted to do were permitted, some were not. The negotiation process around specific jokes or sequences sometimes took weeks. Former writers have described learning to anticipate which elements of a script would trigger standards and practices concern, and either preemptively adjusting them or preparing arguments for why they should be permitted. This adversarial creative relationship is itself a kind of education in how network television operates. Fact 122. The show has been involved in several plagiarism claims over its history, situations in which outside parties argued that a specific joke or storyline had been taken from their work without credit. Most of these claims were resolved without legal action, either through demonstration that the similarity was coincidental given the volume of material the show produces, or through quiet settlements. The volume of The Simpsons' output means that the statistical probability of it producing something similar to someone else's prior work is genuinely significant, which complicates these situations considerably. Fact 123. The episode Homer's Triple Bypass, in which Homer requires heart surgery, was written in part as a response to the writer's awareness that Homer's lifestyle was medically implausible. The episode acknowledges, within the show's world, that eating and drinking the way Homer does should have catastrophic health consequences. It is one of the show's periodic engagements with its own internal logic, moments where the writers decide to let the world of Springfield collide with the actual physics of human biology. The surgery itself is performed by Dr. Nick Riviera, which ensures that the episode's medical content remains firmly in the register of comedy rather than dramatic consequence. Fact 124. The creation of Itchy and Scratchy as a show within a show was itself a subject of creative tension in the writing room. There was disagreement about how extreme the violence in the cartoons should be. Some writers felt the violence should be pushed as far as possible to make the satirical point clearly. Others felt there was a line beyond which the violence became simply unpleasant rather than satirically purposeful. The version that emerged from this tension is precisely calibrated to stay on the right side of that line, extreme enough to make the point but executed with enough visual wit that it reads as comedy rather than gratuitous content. Fact 125. Cape Fear, the Season 5 episode in which Sideshow Bob stalks the Simpson family in a parody of the film Cape Fear, contains the famous sequence in which Bob steps on a series of rakes in increasing bewilderment and pain. The rake sequence began as a single joke in the script and expanded during the production process when the realization that the joke could be extended into a genuinely virtuosic set piece took hold. The final version of the rake sequence is longer than it had any business being and funnier for it, a demonstration of the comedic truth that repetition, handled correctly, is not diminishing but escalating. Fact 126. Who Shot Mr. Burns was produced with a specific security apparatus designed to keep the identity of the shooter secret before broadcast. Scripts were distributed only to the people who absolutely needed to know the ending. The animators who worked on the revelation sequence were given minimal context for the scene they were producing. The production team was genuinely anxious that the answer would leak before the episode aired, given how thoroughly the show had built it up as a genuine cultural event. The reveal managed to stay secret until broadcast, which in the pre-internet era was considerably more achievable than it would be today. Fact 127. The Season 14 episode, The Dad Who Knew Too Little, in which Homer hires a private investigator to learn more about Lisa because he realizes he does not know his own daughter, was the subject of internal debate about whether it crossed a line in how negatively it portrayed Homer as a father. The episode requires Homer to be genuinely ignorant of basic facts about his own child, which some members of the production felt was unfair to a character they cared about. Others felt that the emotional resolution of the episode, in which Homer confronts his failure and tries to do better, earned the earlier darkness. Fact 128. The show's 300th episode, Barding Over, aired in 2003 and featured Tony Hawk and other skateboarding celebrities. It received mixed reviews, and a number of critics used the episode as an opportunity to renew arguments about the show's decline. 300th episodes of television shows are typically occasions for celebration and reflection. But for The Simpsons, the milestone prompted as much anxiety about the future as pride about the past, which says something about where the show's relationship with its own critical reputation stood at that point. Fact 129. The episode Homer vs. Patty and Selma, in which Homer secretly borrows money from Marge's sisters and must endure their contempt as a result, is often cited as one of the better examples of how the show can derive genuine emotional stakes from the internal dynamics of the extended family. The relationship between Homer and Patty and Selma is one of the show's richest ongoing tensions, and episodes that put Homer directly in the sisters' power illuminate something real about the experience of owing a favor to people who already dislike you. Fact 130. The show has used the Treehouse of Horror annual Halloween specials as a space for creative experimentation that the main series does not permit. The specials are explicitly non-canonical, which frees the writers to kill main characters, explore dark themes, and try formal experiments that the regular episode format would not accommodate. Some of the show's most formally inventive and emotionally surprising material has appeared in the Halloween specials precisely because the non-canonical status gives the writers permission to take risks. Fact 131. There was a period in the show's production where the relationship between the showrunner and certain members of the writing staff became severely strained. The details of these tensions have emerged in various interviews and oral histories over the years. The Simpsons writers' room at its peak was a high-pressure environment with significant egos and strong opinions about what the show should be. When those egos and opinions came into conflict with the hierarchy of the room, the results were sometimes creative breakthroughs and sometimes departures. Several of the show's most talented contributors left under circumstances that were more complicated than a simple creative farewell. Fact 132. The show's episode order each season has been a recurring subject of discussion. The standard order for an American network animated series has historically been between 13 and 22 episodes per season. The Simpsons has consistently been at the high end of this range, producing 22 or 23 episodes most seasons. This volume is ambitious by any standard for a series of this complexity. The production of 22 episodes of The Simpsons per year, with the layers of writing, animation, voice recording, and post-production that each episode requires, is a genuine industrial achievement that tends to be underappreciated in discussions of the show's quality fluctuations. Section 7. The music, the sound, the voice. Facts 133 through 154. The sonic world of The Simpsons is as carefully constructed as its visual world, and in some ways more immediately impactful. The theme, the incidental music, the voice performances, the sound effects that have become so familiar they function as a second language for viewers who have been watching for decades. The music of The Simpsons is an enormous subject that deserves its own extended consideration, and here is where we give it some of that consideration. Fact 133. Alf Clausen composed the incidental music for The Simpsons from the second season through the 27th, a span of nearly 3 decades. Clausen's approach to the show's music was unusually sophisticated for a network animated series. He composed for a full orchestra, recording each episode's score with live musicians rather than relying on synthesized music or a library of stock cues. This commitment to live orchestral recording gave the show a musical texture that was richer and more emotionally complex than most animated series achieved. Clausen was replaced in the 28th season by Bleeding Fingers Music, a company that uses a different compositional approach, and the change was noted by longtime viewers as one of the more perceptible shifts in the show's late-period atmosphere. Fact 134. The Simpsons has produced 3 soundtrack albums, released at various points across the show's history. The first, released in 1990, contained some of the show's early incidental music and some songs from the episodes. These albums sold reasonably well but are now primarily of interest to dedicated collectors and historians of the show's musical legacy. Fact 135. Do the Bartman, the single released in 1990 that briefly topped the charts in multiple countries, was written and produced by Michael Jackson, though Jackson was not credited publicly at the time due to contractual restrictions related to his label deal. The song was voiced by Nancy Cartwright, performing as Bart, and achieved genuine commercial success, reaching #1 in the United Kingdom and Australia. The Bartman as a cultural phenomenon was primarily a children's dance craze of the early 1990s, one of those fleeting cultural moments that seems extraordinary in retrospect, because it involved a cartoon character topping pop music charts. Fact 136. The voice performances on The Simpsons are recorded in ensemble, meaning the main cast records together in the same room rather than individually. This is unusual for animated series, which typically record voices separately for scheduling and acoustic control reasons. The ensemble recording approach means the performers can react to each other in real time, can play off each other's choices, can create the kind of conversational chemistry that is difficult to achieve when voices are assembled in isolation. The dynamic between the main cast members during these ensemble recording sessions is one of the things that longtime observers of the show's production cite most often as a source of the show's warmth and authenticity. Fact 137. Dan Castellaneta developed Homer's famous sound of exasperation, which, in the original broadcast, took the form of a long, drawn-out, anguished syllable during the show's early recording sessions. The sound, which has been characterized as a frustrated expression of defeat, was not scripted. It emerged during a recording session and was immediately recognized by the director as something to keep and encourage. The specific form of this sound has evolved slightly across the show's run. The earliest versions are slightly different in quality and duration from the more familiar modern version. Fact 138. Julie Kavner has described the physical toll that Marge's voice takes on her vocal cords. The voice is not produced effortlessly. It requires specific physical control and leaves Kavner's voice slightly raw after extended recording sessions. She has discussed this in terms that suggest it is simply a cost of the performance, something she has accepted as the price of doing this particular work for this particular character. Her willingness to sustain this cost across nearly 4 decades of recording sessions reflects a commitment to the character that goes beyond the purely professional. Fact 139. The saxophone music that Lisa plays in the show was originally composed by a session musician and was intended simply as generic jazz phrases that would establish Lisa's musical competence without requiring specific original composition. Over time, as the show developed specific episodes around Lisa's relationship with music, the saxophone music became more deliberately composed. The specific tones and phrases associated with Lisa's playing have become one of the show's most emotionally resonant musical signatures. When that saxophone sound appears in an episode, it immediately evokes a particular quality of Lisa's interiority, her longing, and her loneliness, and her searching quality. Fact 140. The show has written and produced an extraordinary number of original songs across its history. Every musical number in every episode is an original composition. The rate of original musical production across 36 seasons is staggering. The show has written love songs, novelty songs, rock anthems, country ballads, opera parodies, show tunes, folk songs, and Baroque compositions, and it has produced them at the rate of several per episode for more than 800 episodes. The complete catalog of original Simpsons music is one of the largest in American television history. Fact 141. We Do from the Barbershop Quartet episode Homer's Barbershop Quartet is an example of the show writing an original song that functions as a genuine piece of music independent of its comedic context. The song is funny in context. It is also, by the standards of barbershop composition, a well-crafted piece of harmonically appropriate music. The show has repeatedly demonstrated the ability to write comedy songs that work as actual songs, which requires a combination of musical skill and comedic timing that is genuinely rare. Fact 142. The Monorail song from Marge vs. the Monorail is widely considered one of the greatest comedy songs in the history of American television. It was written by Conan O'Brien as a parody of Ya Got Trouble from The Music Man, the Harold Hill sales pitch that escalates a modest civic concern into a full-blown moral panic. The monorail song performs the same rhetorical trick, using the form of a political speech song to sell a manifestly absurd idea to a room full of people who should know better. The song is formally perfect. Every element of its construction is doing exactly what it needs to do. O'Brien has described it as possibly the piece of writing he is most proud of. Fact 143. See My Vest from 201 Greyhounds is the show's parody of Be Our Guest from Beauty and the Beast, redesigned as a villain's song about wearing dogs. Mr. Burns singing about his plan to turn the Simpson family's greyhound puppies into a vest is a joke that works on multiple levels simultaneously. It is a parody of a specific song from a specific film. It is a character revelation for Burns, a window into the truly extravagant nature of his callousness. And it is simply a very funny song about a very bad idea. Harry Shearer's performance gives Burns a quality of genuine enthusiasm for his awful plan that makes the song impossible to resist. Fact 144. The show has produced full musical episodes. Episodes where the proportion of singing to dialogue is significantly higher than usual. These episodes have met with varying degrees of success. The ones that work are the ones where the musical format serves the story being told rather than existing as a formal experiment for its own sake. Homer and Marge. Bishalom and other musically ambitious episodes demonstrate that the show can sustain an extended musical format when the emotional stakes of the story justify the heightened register that singing requires. Fact 145. Sound effects in The Simpsons are produced by a Foley team that has maintained remarkable consistency across the show's run. The specific sounds associated with Springfield's geography, the clang of the plant's reactor, the specific squeal of the school bus brakes, the sound of Homer falling down a flight of stairs, these are sonic signatures that have been established and maintained as carefully as any visual detail. Viewers who have watched the show for decades can identify specific sounds with specific locations and situations in the way that music listeners can identify a specific guitar tone with a specific recording. Fact 146. The Simpsons has produced several episodes that involve opera, classical music, or other forms of high culture treated with the show's characteristic irreverence. These episodes are consistently among the most interesting in the show's musical history because they require the production team to engage seriously with the form they are satirizing. Effective parody requires deep familiarity with the original, and The Simpsons episodes that satirize classical musical forms demonstrate genuine knowledge of those forms by the writers responsible for them. Fact 147. The voice of Santa's little helper, the family dog, is one of the few recurring character voices on the show that is not performed by a human voice actor but is instead a recorded and manipulated animal sound. The specific dog sounds used for Santa's little helper were recorded from actual dogs and then adjusted in post-production to suggest the specific personality that the show requires from the character. The dog is not a speaking character but is given vocal qualities that express recognizable emotional states. Fact 148. The original music from the Treehouse of Horror episodes is compositionally distinct from the regular series. The Halloween specials have always been given a specifically horror-inflected musical treatment, drawing on the vocabulary of horror film scoring in ways that the regular episodes do not. Clausen brought the same orchestral approach to the special's score, but deliberately adjusted his compositional palette, using more dissonant harmonies, more percussive textures, and more of the slow build and release structure associated with suspense music. Fact 149. The Simpsons has collaborated with the rock band The Who on an episode that used their music in ways that required licensing negotiations of significant complexity. The use of specific recorded tracks in animated content involves multiple layers of rights, including mechanical rights, synchronization rights, and in some cases master recording rights. The administrative infrastructure required to clear music for a show as prolific as The Simpsons is substantial, and the music clearance team for the show, over its history, has navigated one of the most complex licensing environments in television. Fact 150. Happy Birthday to You cannot be used in American film and television without paying a licensing fee, which is why The Simpsons, like virtually every other American television series, uses a different birthday song in episodes involving birthday celebrations. The show has invented multiple fictional birthday songs across its run for use in these situations. Some of these invented songs are themselves jokes, deliberately too short or too strange to function as real birthday songs. The existence of fictional birthday songs in The Simpsons is a small but telling window into the legal and contractual constraints that shape creative decisions in television production. Fact 151. The show's voice actors have had their characters' voices sampled, remixed, and repurposed in internet culture in ways that no one anticipated when the show began. Specific Homer sounds, Bart expressions, Burns catchphrases have become units of digital communication, deployed as reaction content across social media platforms. The actors have varying degrees of philosophical comfort with this development. The sounds they created for fictional characters have escaped the context of the show entirely and now live independently in the digital ecosystem. Fact 152. The musical episode Homer's Barbershop Quartet is notable for the quality of the actual barbershop singing, which was performed by professional session singers supplementing the actors' voices. Barbershop Quartet is a demanding vocal form, with specific requirements for blend, intonation, and ringing chord resonance. The decision to use real barbershop singers for the musical sections elevated the episode's musical content considerably beyond what purely acted singing would have produced. Fact 153. The Simpsons has occasionally used licensed popular music from the rock and pop repertoire in ways that function as genuine emotional cues rather than simply as jokes. Specific songs associated with specific characters, used in specific emotional contexts, create a kind of shorthand that the show has developed over decades. The emotional power of a specific piece of familiar music, applied at the right moment in a Simpsons episode, can produce a response in longtime viewers that is disproportionate to the scene's apparent content. Fact 154. The recording sessions for major musical episodes typically run longer than the recording sessions for standard episodes. The performers are given more time to work through the musical material, to find the right relationship between the singing voice and the speaking character voice. Some of the show's voice actors are trained singers and others are not, and the musical episodes require more support and coaching for the non-singers to produce performances that are both musically adequate and characterologically consistent. Number. Section 8. The Animation Secrets, Facts 155 through 166. The visual world of The Simpsons is the product of thousands of hours of work by animators across multiple continents over multiple decades. Understanding how the show is actually made, the technical and artistic decisions that produce what appears on screen, reveals a hidden layer of craftsmanship beneath the familiar surface of the image. Fact 155. The Simpsons requires approximately 6 months to produce a single episode. This 6-month timeline includes the writing, voice recording, design, animation, post-production, and final delivery processes. The implication is that the production team is always working on multiple episodes simultaneously at different stages of completion. At any given moment during the regular season, the team has scripts being written for future episodes, recordings happening for episodes in the middle of their production cycle, and finished episodes being prepared for broadcast. This overlapping production calendar creates a complex organizational challenge that the show has been managing continuously for more than 30 years. Fact 156. The animation of Springfield's backgrounds, the streets, the buildings, the parks, the interiors of the recurring locations, has been maintained by a team of background artists whose work is largely invisible to casual viewers. These artists are responsible for the visual consistency of the world. They maintain model sheets for every recurring location that specify exactly how the space should look. They are also responsible for the hundreds of temporary locations that appear in individual episodes and are never seen again. A location that appears for 30 seconds of screen time may have required hours of design work. Fact 157. The show transitioned from traditional cell animation to digital animation over the course of the late 1990s and early 2000s. This transition was not instantaneous. For a period, the show was using a combination of traditional and digital methods. The full transition to digital production changed certain qualities of the animation in ways that are subtle but perceptible to viewers with a trained eye. The line quality is slightly different. The color relationships are slightly different. The way movement is interpolated between keyframes is slightly different. Fact 158. The design of Springfield's architecture draws on multiple regional American traditions without settling on any single one. Victorian houses appear next to mid-century ranch homes, appear next to brutalist civic buildings, appear next to strip malls, appear next to old-fashioned Main Street commercial buildings. This architectural eclecticism is partly a result of the show's Every American Town mandate, and partly a product of the different visual references that different background artists brought to their work over the decades. Springfield's architecture is not a coherent historical document. It is a collage. Fact 159. The character designs for the main Simpson family have remained remarkably stable across 3 decades of production, but they are not absolutely identical across all periods. Close comparison of early season Homer with contemporary Homer reveals subtle shifts. The proportions are slightly different. The line weight is slightly different. The way the eyes are drawn is slightly different. These differences are the cumulative result of production changes, different animation supervisors applying their own micro-adjustments, and the natural drift that occurs when a design is interpreted by thousands of different hands over decades. Fact 160. The couch gag has employed a remarkable range of animation techniques over the show's history, including stop motion, computer-generated imagery, hand-drawn animation in deliberately different styles, pixelation, rotoscoping, and techniques borrowed from experimental film. Some of the show's most visually inventive sequences exist within the couch gag format, where the non-canonical nature of the content provides freedom that the main show's visual consistency does not permit. Several filmmakers and artists have been invited to create couch gags in their own distinctive styles, including John Kricfalusi, creator of Ren and Stimpy, whose couch gag is arguably the most disturbing sequence the show has ever aired. Fact 161. The show's overseas animation studios, which have changed over the decades as the production has moved between different partners, each leave a distinctive fingerprint in the animation quality of the episodes they worked on. Knowledgeable viewers can often identify which studio animated a particular episode from the early seasons by looking at the way certain types of movement are handled, the way crowd scenes are populated, the way background characters are simplified when they are far from the focal point of a scene. Fact 162. The storyboarding process for The Simpsons is more elaborate than most animated television series because of the density of visual jokes and the specificity of the comedic timing required. Storyboard artists work closely with directors to translate scripts into visual sequences, and the decisions made at the storyboarding stage have a significant impact on whether a joke works. A joke that is timed correctly on paper but visualized poorly at the storyboard stage may become unfunny by the time it reaches the screen. The best storyboard artists on the show have been described as intuitive comedy directors, people who understand not just how to translate a written scene into a sequence of drawings, but how to make the drawings funnier than the words. Fact 163. The show's use of extreme close-ups as a comedic technique was established in the early seasons and has remained a consistent visual tool. A close-up on Homer's face at the moment of realization. A close-up on a prop that reveals a detail the main shot did not show. A close-up that turns something mundane into something strange by the virtue of scale. The show's directors have used the close-up with particular economy, which is what gives it its power. When the show cuts to an extreme close-up, it means something is there worth seeing. Fact 164. The animation of Homer eating has been treated as a specific craft challenge across the show's history. Homer eats more often and more enthusiastically than almost any character in American animation history, and the specific visual language of his eating has been developed and refined across decades. The way his eyes go slightly unfocused when food enters his mouth. The specific sounds associated with his consumption, the physical transformation that happens to his posture when he is eating something he loves. These are performance details that the animators have developed through close observation of Dan Castellaneta's vocal performance and through their own ongoing refinement of the character's physical comedy vocabulary. Fact 165. The design of Maggie Simpson's pacifier has been maintained with extraordinary precision across the show's history. The specific shape, the specific color, the specific way it sits in her mouth, these details have been specified in model sheets and maintained by the art department through all the production transitions the show has experienced. This is partly because the pacifier is so visually prominent, the center of Maggie's face in most shots, that any inconsistency would be immediately noticeable. Fact 166. The Simpson house at 742 Evergreen Terrace has been animated with a floor plan that has changed substantially across the show's history. In early episodes, the spatial relationships between rooms suggest a relatively modest house. In later episodes, rooms that should not fit given the house's apparent size have been revealed. The basement, the attic, rooms whose function changes from episode to episode. The Simpson house is larger on the inside than it appears from the outside, which is either a continuity error or an extremely subtle metaphor, and either way it is one of the show's most persistently documented spatial mysteries. Number. Section 9. The Real-World Connections. Facts 167 through 180. The Simpsons does not exist in isolation from the world that made it. It was shaped by real events, real people, real anxieties about what America was and what it was becoming. And in turn, it has shaped those things, filtered back into the culture that produced it, changed how people talk and think and understand themselves. The connections between Springfield and the real world run deeper than most viewers recognize. Fact 167. The episode Homer's Enemy was written partly in response to fan criticism that Homer's life was too comfortable given his obvious incompetence. Fan letters and early internet discussion had begun to note that Homer's life did not make logical sense, that a person as oblivious and professionally negligent as Homer would never retain his job, would never have the house, the car, the relative domestic stability that the show depicted him enjoying. The episode's character Frank Grimes is the show's direct response to this observation. He is the person who makes the argument the fans were making, and the show's response to him is deliberately troubling. Fact 168. The Springfield nuclear power plant's design was based partly on real American nuclear facilities, and partly on the comedic logic of making the most dangerous possible version of such a facility. The show's early writers did research into how nuclear plants actually operate, which is why certain technical details in the show are surprisingly accurate. The three-eyed fish, while fictional, is a reference to a real category of concern about nuclear contamination of waterways that environmental advocates were raising during the period when the show began. The fish is a joke, but it is a joke built on a real anxiety. Fact 169. The show's portrayal of Springfield's political culture, its corrupt mayor, its incompetent police force, its captured media, its unaccountable billionaire, is a satirical portrait that has become more recognizable, not less, as the decades have passed. The show was describing a specific failure mode of American civic culture in the early 90s. That failure mode has intensified since then, which is why Springfield reads as more realistic in 2025 than it did in 1992. Mayor Quimby's combination of Kennedy mannerism and fundamental corruption was a caricature when the show began. It is now a recognizable political archetype. Fact 170. The show engaged directly with the First Gulf War in several episodes produced during and immediately after the conflict. American television in 1991 was saturated with Gulf War coverage, and The Simpsons, as a show that prided itself on engaging with current events, could not ignore it. The episodes that dealt with the war did so with the show's characteristic obliqueness, making the point through allegory and satire rather than direct commentary. The political anxieties of that moment are visible in the texture of those episodes even now. Fact 171. The show produced an episode in the mid-90s that engaged directly with the O.J. Simpson trial, which was the dominant news story of the period. The episode's engagement with the trial was careful. The show did not want to be seen as taking a position on a case that was both racially charged and legally unresolved. Instead, it treated the trial as a piece of ambient cultural noise, something that Springfield was processing the way real American communities were processing it, through constant media consumption and endless argumentation that produced no consensus. Fact 172. Matt Groening has cited Gary Larson's Far Side cartoon as a significant influence on the show's approach to visual comedy. Larson's cartoons frequently depended on a single image that contained multiple layers of meaning, jokes that only worked if you understood a specific reference or registered a specific detail in the background. The Simpsons translated this principle into animated television, producing episodes that contained visible information at multiple levels of attention simultaneously. Fact 173. The show has engaged with major American disasters, including the 1994 Northridge earthquake, in episodes that tried to process collective trauma through comedy. The earthquake episode is interesting because it attempts to do something that comedy is not naturally suited to, which is to honor the gravity of a real catastrophic event while maintaining the show's fundamentally comedic register. The episodes that attempt this are among the show's most formally daring, and they succeed to varying degrees. Fact 174. Springfield's relationship to race is one of the show's most complex and least discussed dimensions. The town is predominantly white in its main cast and its cultural orientation, but it includes characters from multiple backgrounds, and the show has engaged with questions of race and racism in episodes throughout its run. The quality of this engagement has been inconsistent. Some episodes handle racial subjects with genuine thoughtfulness. Others have been criticized for relying on stereotypes in ways that the show's satire does not fully redeem. The Apu situation discussed earlier is the most prominent example of this inconsistency, but it is not the only one. Fact 175. The show has been used as educational material in contexts ranging from college courses in media studies to discussions of political satire in journalism schools. Its longevity and cultural reach make it a uniquely useful object of study for anyone interested in how American culture represents itself to itself. The show contains, across its run, a remarkable documentary record of American anxieties, preoccupations, and self-images from 1989 through the present. Watching the show chronologically is in some ways like reading an eccentric, satirical American history of the past 4 decades. Fact 176. The show's portrayal of the American working class, and specifically of the experience of being a blue-collar worker in the age of industrial decline, is one of its most consistently serious thematic concerns beneath the comedy. Homer's job at the plant is not presented as a good job in the way that sitcom jobs are often presented as providing adequate satisfaction and dignity. It is presented as a fundamentally alienated form of labor, a job Homer did not choose and does not understand, performed inside a building whose purpose is vaguely threatening. The comedy that surrounds Homer's work life does not dissolve this underlying darkness. It exists alongside it. Fact 177. The show has aired in more than 100 countries and has been dubbed into dozens of languages. The translation and dubbing process for a show as linguistically rich and culturally specific as The Simpsons is enormously complex. Jokes that depend on wordplay, cultural references, or specific English-language idioms must be adapted for each target language. The quality of these adaptations varies significantly. Some dubbed versions of the show are regarded by viewers in their respective countries as genuinely excellent translations that find local equivalents for the show's humor. Others are considered adequate at best. Fact 178. The show's Japanese opening sequence, designed for the show's Japanese broadcast, is notably different from the American version. Japanese animation conventions and the specific requirements of Japanese television standards for animated opening sequences shaped a version of The Simpsons introduction that reflects those conventions, rather than the American ones. The existence of this alternate opening is an interesting reminder that the show we think of as universal is actually culturally specific in ways that become apparent when it is adapted for different markets. Fact 179. The show has produced merchandise in quantities that defy easy enumeration. The Simpson family has appeared on clothing, food packaging, toys, video games, theme park attractions, and thousands of other commercial products. The Simpsons licensing business, which has generated billions of dollars across the show's history, is itself a commentary on the very commercial culture that the show frequently satirizes. The show that makes jokes about corporate greed has become one of the most commercially exploited properties in entertainment history. The irony is not lost on the show's more self-aware creators. Fact 180. The Springfield theme park area at Universal Studios, which opened in 2022, represents the most complete physical realization of the show's world that has ever been constructed. The area includes a functional recreation of the Quick E-Mart, a Moe's Tavern where guests can drink, and several attraction experiences based on Springfield locations. The experience of visiting this physical Springfield is genuinely strange for longtime fans, because it forces a reconciliation between the cartoon world, which exists in the register of pure imagination, and physical space, which operates under entirely different constraints. Number. Section 10. The Final Mysteries. Facts 181 through 199. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. We have seen things that most people walk past without noticing. We have heard stories from behind the closed doors of the writer's room. We have watched characters that we thought we knew reveal themselves as stranger and richer than they appeared. And now, in the final stretch, here are the 19 facts that sit at the edge of what the show has revealed about itself. The things that are almost explained, the things that persist as open questions, the things that are true about The Simpsons that no one has quite put into words. Fact 181. The show has never definitively explained why Homer continues to work for Mr. Burns despite having endured every possible form of professional humiliation, physical harm, and casual cruelty that a workplace can offer. Various explanations have been advanced across the series. The deal between Burns and Grandpa, Homer's own economic anxiety, his inability to imagine a different life, his strange loyalty to the familiar even when the familiar is bad for him. The accumulation of these explanations across the show's history suggests that Homer's continued employment at the plant is not the product of any single cause, but of a complex entanglement of economic necessity, psychological damage, and narrative convenience that the show has been building and rebuilding for 36 years. Fact 182. Maggie Simpson has spoken more words across the show's history than the show typically acknowledges. In addition to Elizabeth Taylor's daddy, Maggie has been given brief moments of speech in several episodes. Each of these moments is treated as remarkable, as a rupture in her established pattern of silence, and each is quickly recontained. The show has never allowed Maggie to develop into a speaking character because the silence is too important to the character's function within the show's ecology. She is the observer, the one who sees without being seen. Giving her sustained speech would change what she is. Fact 183. The character of Hans Moleman, the elderly, near-blind man who is repeatedly killed across the show's history, has never been given a definitive canonical backstory that explains who he is, where he came from, or why he keeps surviving things that should definitively end him. His stated age of 31 is one of the show's most consistently unreliable pieces of information. Whether this is a joke about how badly the town's environment ages its residents, or simply an absurdist non sequitur, is one of the minor persistent mysteries that fans have debated for decades. Fact 184. The show has occasionally broken the fourth wall in ways that are subtle enough to go unremarked upon. A character glancing at the camera in a way that suggests awareness of the audience. A moment of dialogue that seems to address the viewer's potential confusion directly. These moments are rare enough to be interesting when they appear, and they create a brief, disorienting sense that the characters know they are being watched. The most explicit fourth wall breaks are in the Treehouse of Horror episodes, where they are an expected convention of the format. In regular episodes, they are surprises. Fact 185. The show's treatment of religion has been one of its most consistent and most carefully handled thematic territories. Springfield has a specific relationship with faith that is neither purely satirical nor reverential. God appears in the show. He speaks. He has preferences and opinions and a relationship with Homer that is unaccountable and funny and occasionally touching. But the show also takes Ned Flanders' faith seriously enough to portray its cost honestly, to show what it does to a person to believe deeply in a framework that the universe seems uninterested in honoring. The show's theological position, if it has one, is that faith is real and meaningful as a human phenomenon, even when the universe provides no confirmation of its object. Fact 186. The long-running romantic relationship between Homer and Marge is one of television's most enduring and most quietly revolutionary portrayals of a marriage. The show has allowed Homer and Marge to have genuine tensions, genuine differences, genuine moments where it is not clear that they will stay together. And it has also shown them, repeatedly, choosing each other. Not out of obligation or inertia, but out of a recognition that what they have, despite its chaos and its frustrations, is something worth protecting. The moments in the show where Homer and Marge's love for each other is expressed are among its most genuinely moving, partly because the show has earned them through its honesty about the difficulty of the relationship. Fact 187. The show has referenced its own longevity and cultural saturation many times across its run, in ways that range from self-congratulatory to genuinely self-critical. Some of the most interesting meta-episodes in the show's history are the ones that engage honestly with the question of what it means for a television show to keep running past the point where anyone expected it to survive. These episodes ask what the characters owe each other, what the show owes its audience, what it means to tell the same stories about the same family for decades without significant change. They do not fully answer these questions, but the fact that the show asks them is itself a form of honesty. Fact 188. There are moments across the show's history where the comedy and the sadness exist in the same space simultaneously, without the show forcing a resolution between them. The scene at the end of Mother Simpson, where Homer sits alone on the hood of his car, looking at the night sky after watching his mother drive away. The final moments of And Maggie Makes Three, where Homer's workplace frustration is revealed to be papered over by photographs of Maggie at his station. The closing of Lisa's Substitute, where Mr. Bergstrom's farewell note to Lisa contains 4 words that the episode earns completely. These moments are the show at its most specifically brilliant, doing something that only this show, in this format, with this specific combination of comedy and emotional intelligence, could do. Fact 189. The show's satire of the media has aged in specific and uneven ways. The portrayals of local television news, of media hysteria, of celebrity culture, of the way stories are shaped by the needs of broadcast rather than the demands of truth, are remarkably prescient. Kent Brockman's cheerful willingness to deliver any news in the same polished, concerned register regardless of how insane the content is a more accurate portrait of television news performance now than it was when it was written. Other aspects of the show's media satire have dated more quickly, tied to specific technologies or specific cultural moments that no longer have the same resonance. Fact 190. The show has a specific relationship with death that it has maintained and developed across its run. Death happens in Springfield. Real characters die, not just minor background figures. The death of Marcia Wallace's character, Edna Krabappel, following Wallace's real-world passing, was handled with a dignity and genuine feeling that the show has not always managed in similar situations. The death of Mona Simpson. The death of Bleeding Gums Murphy, whose passing in Season 6 is one of the show's first genuinely sad moments. A death that affects a main character in ways the show does not try to resolve quickly. Fact 191. The show has never settled on a consistent theory of time travel, which has been used as a plot device in multiple Treehouse of Horror segments. Each version of time travel in the show operates differently, with different rules and different consequences. This inconsistency is partly a product of the Treehouse episode's non-canonical status, but it also reflects the show's general comfort with internal contradiction as a comedic and narrative resource. Fact 192. The Springfield of the show's later seasons is a different place from the Springfield of the early seasons in ways that go beyond production quality. The town has accumulated history. It has buildings that reference past events. It has citizens whose storylines are cross-referenced across decades of episodes. The later Springfield is denser with its own mythology in ways that new viewers experience as a richness and longtime viewers experience as a weight. The show's world has become genuinely larger than any individual episode can fully hold. Fact 193. The show has been running long enough that it has depicted the same historical events multiple times, with different characters experiencing them. The Super Bowl, New Year's Eve in specific years, election nights, cultural events that would have meant different things in different decades. The show's floating timeline means that these events are always fresh, always present, never relegated to the past. Springfield is perpetually in the contemporary moment, which means the show has described the contemporary moment dozens of times from slightly different angles. Fact 194. The question of what a perfect Simpsons episode is has been debated since the internet made this kind of debate possible. There are perhaps 50 episodes that appear on some version of every best of list, but the episodes that sit just outside this consensus group, the ones that are great without quite being on everyone's short list, reveal the most about what the show is capable of at its best. The show's excellence is not contained in a small number of masterpieces. It is distributed across an enormous body of work, most of which is better than it gets credit for. Fact 195. The show's relationship with its own merchandise has been treated as a source of comedy within the show itself. Krusty the Clown, as the show's primary character who licenses his image to commercial products, embodies the show's ambivalence about its own commercial success. Krusty sells things he does not believe in, endorses products he has never tried, allows his face to be attached to goods of questionable quality in exchange for money. This is what the show does, and the show knows it, and Krusty is the show's way of laughing at itself about it. Fact 196. The show has depicted the interior of Homer's imagination and Homer's dreams in ways that are consistently revealing. Homer's fantasy life is specific and recognizable. He imagines things going right, He imagines himself as more capable and more respected than he is. He imagines food in elaborate sensory detail. He imagines a version of his family where everyone is happy and no one is in trouble. His dreams are not dark. They are the dreams of someone who fundamentally wants simple things and has lived in a world that has made those simple things complicated. Fact 197. There are characters in The Simpsons who have never spoken on screen, despite appearing across dozens of episodes. The background residents of Springfield who appear consistently in crowd scenes, at town hall meetings, in the bleachers at sporting events, have become recognizable without ever being given names or dialogue or any conventional form of characterization. They are Springfield made visible. They populate the world and make it feel inhabited without requiring the show to do the work of making them real. Fact 198. The show's commitment to visual storytelling, to communicating through image as much as through dialogue, is one of its least discussed strengths. The Simpsons is often talked about as a writer's show, and it is. But the best episodes of the show are also beautifully constructed visual objects. Episodes where the direction, the composition of the frame, the use of color and movement to reinforce or complicate what the dialogue is saying is as considered as anything in live-action television. The show deserves to be watched, not just listened to. Fact 199. The final mystery, and the one that all the others point toward, is simply this. The show is still being made. 36 seasons in, 800 and more episodes deep, the people who make The Simpsons still get up every day and go to work on a show that has outlasted every prediction, every dismissal, every argument that it should have ended years or decades ago. The characters are still in their house. The family is still together. Springfield is still out there somewhere, impossible to find on any map, present in the imagination of everyone who has ever watched. Whatever explanation you prefer for why Springfield works the way it does, whatever theory you carry with you when you look at those yellow faces and those four fingers and that cracked cooling tower on the horizon, the show keeps going. The loop keeps floating. The credits keep rolling. And every Sunday, if you want it, Springfield is there. Still the same house, still the same family, still the same town that nobody can quite leave and nobody quite understands and everybody, somewhere in the quiet part of themselves, calls home. Let us go back to the beginning one more time, because the origin of The Simpsons deserves more space than most histories give it. The story of how a television institution gets built from almost nothing, from a 15-minute sketch on a legal pad in a waiting room, is a story about luck and timing and the specific chemistry of people who happen to be in rooms together at exactly the right moment. And it is worth sitting with that story a little longer, because the things that almost went differently are as interesting as the things that happened. Matt Groening had been working on Life in Hell for nearly a decade before The Simpsons meeting. The strip appeared in alternative news weeklies across the country, the kind of scrappy, independent papers that existed in every major American city in the 1980s as alternatives to the mainstream press. Life in Hell was dark, neurotic, autobiographical in a way that made it uncomfortable and funny in equal measure. The rabbits, Binky and Sheba, the ambiguously gendered couple Akbar and Jeff, the recurring childhood and workplace anxieties that the strip mined for its comedy, these were the products of a sensibility that was genuinely unusual in American cartooning at the time. Groening was doing something in that strip that had no direct equivalent. He was drawing his own psychological interior as a cartoon and asking readers to recognize themselves in it. The decision not to pitch Life in Hell to James L. Brooks is often described as instinctive, a split-second calculation made in a waiting room. But it was also a genuinely sophisticated understanding of intellectual property and creative control. Groening had watched other cartoonists sign away their work and lose the ability to control what happened to it. He was not willing to do that with something he had built slowly, personally, over years. The family he invented as a replacement was less precious to him in that moment precisely because he had just invented it. It was disposable in a way that Life in Hell was not. The irony is that the disposable family became immortal, and the precious strip remained a cult object known primarily to a specific kind of person who read alternative news weeklies in the 1980s. James L. Brooks's involvement in The Simpsons is sometimes underestimated in popular accounts of the show's history. Brooks was not a passive patron who simply opened doors and stepped aside. He was an active, creative collaborator who brought specific qualities to the project that Groening could not have provided alone. Brooks had a deep understanding of television as a medium for emotional storytelling. His work on The Mary Tyler Moore Show and Taxi had demonstrated that sitcoms could have genuine warmth and psychological complexity without abandoning their comedic purpose. He brought this understanding to The Simpsons and pushed, consistently, for the show to have emotional stakes beneath its comedy. The moments in The Simpsons that feel genuinely moving, that go beyond pure joke delivery into something that touches the heart, are not accidents. They reflect Brooks's insistence that the show earn its emotional moments rather than simply gesture at them. The Tracey Ullman Show, which hosted The Simpsons shorts, was itself a significant television experiment of the late 1980s. The show was conceived as a variety program featuring the British comedian Tracey Ullman in a series of sketches and musical numbers. It was Fox's attempt to establish a distinctive identity in the increasingly competitive television landscape. The Simpsons shorts were inserted between segments as filler, a way to use animation to pad out the running time without incurring the cost of additional sketch segments. The shorts were not, by any account, the centerpiece of the Tracey Ullman Show. They were an afterthought that became the only reason most people remember the show existed. The quality of the Tracey Ullman Show shorts improved noticeably across the 3 years of their run. The first shorts are genuinely primitive, not just technically but in terms of characterization and comedic timing. The characters are broader, the jokes are simpler, the emotional texture is thinner. By the final shorts, you can see the outlines of the show that would emerge. The character relationships are more specific. The comedy is sharper. The voices are more settled into who these people are. Watching the full run of Tracey Ullman shorts in order is like watching a band find their sound across a series of early recordings. The finished thing is visible in embryo. The decision to give The Simpsons its own half-hour show was not made quickly. Fox spent considerable time evaluating whether the shorts had the kind of audience following that would justify the investment of a full series. The ratings for the Tracey Ullman Show were not spectacular, but The Simpsons shorts consistently generated disproportionate comment and attention relative to the rest of the program. People were talking about the animated family in a way they were not talking about Tracey Ullman's sketches, which was useful information. The network concluded, eventually, that the audience existed and placed the order. The Christmas special that became the show's premiere was written and produced under significant time pressure. The decision to use a Christmas episode as the series premiere was itself unusual. Christmas specials are typically produced for shows that already have an established audience, a context in which the special register of the holiday programming has meaning relative to what the show normally does. Producing a Christmas special as an introduction to characters the audience had never seen in a full-length format was a gamble. It required viewers to care about these people quickly enough that the emotional beats of the Christmas story would land. Remarkably, it worked. The episode's warmth, its specific rendering of a working-class family trying to have a good Christmas, despite financial pressure, connected with viewers immediately. The show had an audience before it had a second episode. The animation of the first season reflects the specific challenges of the offshore production model in ways that are interesting to examine now. The South Korean animators at Klasky Supo were working from production boards and written notes sent across an enormous distance without the ability to have real-time conversations with the American directors about what they needed. The cultural and linguistic barriers compounded the geographical ones. The American production team would see finished animation and send notes about what needed to change. And by the time those notes were received and acted on, the next batch of material was already in production. The feedback loop was too slow for the kind of iterative refinement that good animation requires. The workarounds the team developed across the first 3 seasons were creative and often effective, but the underlying structural problem, the difficulty of quality controlling animation produced at such a distance and such speed, was never fully solved. What the early seasons have that the later seasons sometimes lack is a specific quality of roughness that, paradoxically, makes them feel more alive. The animation in those early episodes is less polished, the character movements less smooth, the expressions less precisely calibrated, but there is an energy in that roughness, a sense of something being discovered in real time that is genuinely exciting to watch. The show in its early seasons did not know exactly what it was learning. And the process of learning is visible on screen in ways that are more interesting, in retrospect, than the smooth confidence of the later production years. The show's cultural impact in its first 2 seasons was immediate and, by any measure, extraordinary. Bart Simpson was on t-shirts within months of the premiere. The phrase, "Don't have a cow," man entered the national vocabulary with a speed that is difficult to explain to anyone who did not live through it. The show had found a frequency that American culture in 1990 was prepared to receive, a combination of irreverence and warmth, of cartoon absurdity and genuine family feeling, that connected with an audience that had not quite seen this combination before. The merchandising explosion of the early 90s created its own problems for the show's creators. Bart's image was everywhere, but the show's creators had limited control over how that image was used. The Bart who appeared on bootleg t-shirts, on unlicensed street merchandise, on products that had no connection to the show's actual values or sensibility, was a simplified version of the character, reduced to his most provocative surface features. The show was simultaneously a critically acclaimed television innovation and a mass commercial phenomenon, and managing both identities at once required a kind of institutional agility that the production team had not been fully prepared for when they started. The process by which fictional characters become themselves is one of the stranger aspects of creative production. Characters begin as ideas, as types, as functions within a narrative structure, and then, through the alchemy of performance and writing and audience response, they become something more than their origins. They develop interiority, they acquire history, they start to constrain what the show can do with them, not because of any formal rule, but because the audience has developed an understanding of who they are that the show cannot violate without losing something essential. Homer Simpson's evolution from mean-edged buffoon to lovable disaster is the clearest example of this process in the show's history. The early Homer is funnier in a simpler way than the later Homer. His anger is more sudden, his selfishness more naked, his relationship with his family more transactional. He is recognizable as a type before he becomes an individual. The transformation into someone specific, into Homer J. Simpson with his particular history and his particular set of wounds and his particular way of wanting things, happened gradually across the first 4 seasons as the writing staff discovered who this man actually was. The key insight that unlocked Homer as a character was the recognition that his stupidity was not the most interesting thing about him. The most interesting thing about Homer was his emotional hunger. Homer is a man who needs to be loved and does not have the capacity to earn love through the conventional means of competence and reliability and thoughtfulness. He is too foolish for those things. So he tries to earn love through enthusiasm and through loyalty, through an all-in quality of showing up for the people he cares about even when his showing up makes everything worse. This is a much richer comedic and emotional engine than simple buffoonery, and once the writers found it, the show never looked back. Marge Simpson has been, across the show's history, both the show's most underserved main character and one of its most quietly essential ones. The show has repeatedly identified Marge's patience and goodness as the foundation that holds the family together, the thing that makes the Simpson household survivable, despite Homer's chaos and Bart's mayhem and Lisa's idealism and the general ambient disaster of Springfield. But having identified this quality, the show has sometimes struggled to build interesting stories around it. Marge is hardest to write for, the writers have said in various interviews, because her defining qualities are virtues. And virtues are harder to generate comedy from than flaws. The episodes that work best for Marge are the ones that put her virtues under genuine pressure, that show what it costs her to be the patient one, the stable one, the person everyone else gets to lean on. Marge versus The Monorail works partly because it shows Marge as the only person in Springfield who sees through the obvious con, which positions her intelligence and her realism as equally definitive as her patience. Fear of Flying works because it takes Marge's anxiety seriously rather than treating it as a comedic obstacle. The best Marge episodes are the ones that honor the full weight of what she carries and let her put it down briefly and breathe. Bart's relationship with the show's comedy has evolved in ways that parallel the cultural trajectory of the rebel archetype he embodied. In the early 90s, Bart was transgressive in a specific way that felt genuinely charged. The irreverent kid who talked back to authority, who saw through adult pretension, who refused to conform to the expectations of the school and the church and the neighborhood. This was a type that resonated powerfully at that particular cultural moment. As the 90s progressed, and as the Bart archetype was replicated and diluted across popular culture, the original lost some of its edge. The show responded by developing Bart's interior life, by giving him genuine vulnerabilities, by showing his relationship with Homer as something that runs deeper than the comedy of mutual exasperation. The Bart and Homer relationship is one of the show's richest ongoing dynamics, precisely because it contains such contradiction. Homer and Bart genuinely exasperate each other. Homer's response to Bart's provocations is frequently violence, a strangling gag that the show has never fully resolved the ethics of. But beneath the exasperation and the violence is a real attachment, a specific father-son love that the show has depicted across dozens of episodes with genuine warmth. Homer believes in Bart in ways he cannot always articulate. Bart needs Homer's approval in ways he would never admit. The episodes that make this explicit, that bring the relationship's full weight to the surface, are among the show's most emotionally powerful. Lisa Simpson's relationship with the show has always been the most complex of any main character. She is the show's moral voice, the character most invested in the difference between how Springfield is and how it should be. This makes her potentially the show's most dramatically serious character and potentially its least funny one. The writing staff has spent 36 years trying to find the balance between Lisa's seriousness and the show's fundamental commitment to comedy. Sometimes they find it perfectly. Sometimes they don't. The episodes that fail Lisa are the ones that reduce her to a lecture platform, that use her as a vehicle for message delivery without giving her a genuine character journey to undertake. The episodes that succeed with Lisa are the ones that show her trying and failing and trying again, that honor her intelligence while also showing its limitations, that acknowledge that being the smartest person in a room that doesn't listen is lonely in ways that comedy can illuminate but cannot fix. Maggie's genius, the idea that the show's quietest member is also its most remarkable, is one of those character concepts that the show has circled without fully committing to across its entire run. The Longest Daycare short demonstrated what Maggie could do when the show gave her the full focus. When the camera was with her perspective exclusively and there was no family chaos to provide context. The result was genuinely startling. A 7-minute film with no dialogue that managed to be funnier, more emotionally engaging, and more formally inventive than many full-length episodes. Maggie works best when the show treats her silence as a form of full presence rather than a form of absence. The secondary characters of Springfield deserve more credit than they typically receive for the show's overall richness. When people talk about The Simpsons, they talk about Homer, Bart, Lisa, Marge, but the specific texture of Springfield, the quality that makes it feel like a real community rather than a backdrop for a family sitcom, comes from the depth and specificity of the secondary cast. Moe's loneliness, Barney's wasted potential, Apu's dignity, Ned's anguish, Kent Brockman's moral flexibility. These are not sketch characters. They are people with interior lives that the show has built carefully across decades of episodic accumulation. Each of them has a history, a psychology, a specific way of wanting things that the show has revealed gradually across hundreds of small moments. The development of Sideshow Bob from one-time foil to recurring nemesis is a masterclass in how to expand a character without violating what made them interesting in the first place. Bob works in every appearance because the show never loses sight of his fundamental nature, which is the tragedy of a genuinely gifted person whose gifts have been bent toward destruction. Bob is intelligent, cultured, capable of real feeling. He is also murderous, obsessive, and constitutionally incapable of accepting defeat with grace. This combination, the high intelligence in service of a profoundly stupid vendetta, is what makes him endlessly renewable as a comedic and dramatic presence. He can show up in any context, in any part of the world, and the joke is always the same joke. Here is a man of enormous capability doing something completely insane. The writer's room of The Simpsons in its golden age was a place that former members describe with a specific quality of reverent nostalgia. Not nostalgia for the experience of being there, which was by most accounts exhausting and occasionally miserable, but nostalgia for the work that came out of it. The recognition that they were doing something that had not quite been done before, and that the specific combination of people and pressure and cultural moment that made it possible would not recur. The room operated on a specific social logic. Everyone in it was, by the standards of their respective fields, exceptionally intelligent. Several held advanced degrees in mathematics or the sciences. Several had published outside of television. Several had come from stand-up comedy backgrounds and had the kind of performing intelligence that stand-up requires, the ability to read a room and adjust in real time. The combination of these different kinds of intelligence, analytic and performative and literary and comedic, was part of what gave the room its specific quality. The jokes that emerged from it could be operating on multiple levels simultaneously because the people making them were capable of thinking on multiple levels simultaneously. The pressure in the room was real and constant. The production schedule never relented. There was always an episode that was behind, always a script that needed to be finished by tomorrow, always a joke that was not quite working that needed to be fixed before the read-through. The writers describe living inside this pressure for years, and some of them describe it as the thing that made the work possible. The pressure created a specific kind of focus. There was no time for self-indulgence, no time for extended philosophical debate about what the show should be, no time for anything except finding the funniest version of the scene that was due in the morning. This constraint was also a creative engine. John Swartzwelder's 59-episode writing credit is a number that becomes more remarkable the more you think about it. For context, most television writers who spend their careers on a single successful show might accumulate somewhere between 20 and 40 writing credits across a full run, if they stay with the show consistently and if the show is long-running. Swartzwelder wrote nearly 60 episodes of The Simpsons and is widely considered responsible for some of the show's absolute best material. Homer Goes to College, Selma's Choice, Itchy and Scratchy Land, Bart the Murderer, Homer the Vigilante, Duffless, Last Exit to Springfield. These are episodes that appear on virtually every serious list of the show's finest work. They share a specific quality, an internal consistency of comedic logic, a willingness to follow an absurd premise wherever it leads without ever winking at the audience about how absurd it is. Swartzwelder's writing has a quality that is almost impossible to describe without resorting to examples. He builds jokes on top of other jokes in a way that feels spontaneous, but is clearly the product of rigorous construction. He will establish a comedic premise, develop it to its logical conclusion, and then reveal that the conclusion was itself the setup for something funnier. His plots move with a speed that requires active engagement from the viewer and rewards that engagement generously. The experience of watching a Swartzwelder episode is the experience of realizing, repeatedly, that you are watching something that is funnier than you initially understood it to be. The no hugging, no learning rule, articulated by Mike Reiss, is more nuanced in practice than the phrase suggests. The rule was never an absolute prohibition on emotional moments or character growth. It was a rule about the kinds of emotional moments the show would permit. Sentimentality was prohibited. Easy lessons were prohibited. The kind of family sitcom ending where everyone learns something and comes together in warm resolution was prohibited. But genuine emotion, the kind that emerges from a specific character in a specific situation, was not only permitted but encouraged. The best emotional moments in The Simpsons are the ones that feel earned rather than manufactured, the ones that arrive because the episode has done the work of putting a character in a situation where emotion is the only honest response. The rule was designed to produce exactly this distinction. The show's relationship with topicality is one of its more interesting formal qualities. The Simpsons is a show that has always wanted to be current, to engage with what is happening in American culture at the moment of each episode's production. But the 6-month production lag between writing and broadcast means that the show is always engaging with a world that was current 6 months ago, which creates a specific challenge. Some topical references date badly. A joke about a specific news story that seemed timely when the script was written can seem dated or obscure by the time the episode airs. The writers learned over time to write jokes that were topical in feeling rather than in specific reference, jokes that captured the texture of the present moment, rather than commenting on specific events that might not still be relevant. The show's long-running tradition of the Springfield town meeting is itself a form of social satire that the writers have refined across decades. The town meeting episodes, in which Springfield's residents gather in the town hall to address some collective crisis, are among the show's most reliable comedic set pieces. They work because the crowd dynamics of the town meeting format allow the show to rapidly sketch many different characters and perspectives in a compressed space. The town meeting is a stage on which Springfield's entire social ecology is visible, from Burns's domination of civic discourse to Homer's combination of strong opinion and complete ignorance to Lisa's frustrated accuracy to the crowd's terrifying willingness to be led in any direction by whoever spoke. Most recently, with the most confidence, the writers of The Simpsons have described the process of finding a story that works as the hardest single task in comedy television. The show has a specific set of constraints that make story generation difficult. The characters cannot fundamentally change. The relationships between characters cannot fundamentally change. Springfield's basic social structure cannot fundamentally change. Within these constraints, the show must produce 22 original stories per season, each of which must be different from the stories it has already told, each of which must justify its own existence by being both funny and emotionally coherent. After 800 episodes, the space of available stories is genuinely narrower than it once was, and the writers are working harder for the same results. The show's use of the B-plot, the secondary story that runs parallel to the main story and is resolved in the same episode, is something the writers have developed into a specific craft. The best B-plots are not simply diversions from the main story. They are thematic counterpoints that illuminate the main story from a different angle, or they are comedic releases that provide relief from the main story's emotional weight. The relationship between A and B plots in a great Simpsons episode has the quality of a piece of music in which two melodic lines are developed simultaneously and brought together at the end in a way that reveals how they always belonged together. The density of visual information in a Simpsons episode is extraordinary by any standard of American broadcast animation. The show was designed, from its earliest seasons, to operate on multiple registers of attention simultaneously. A viewer who watches once absorbs the story, the main jokes, the broad strokes of character and situation. A viewer who watches again notices the background details, the signs and headlines and book titles and visual jokes that populate the margins of the frame. A viewer who watches a third time, if such a person exists and they do exist, begins to see the micro details, the production choices made at the level of individual frames, the moments where the animation itself is making a joke that the voice track does not acknowledge. This multi-level design philosophy was not accidental. It was a deliberate response to the specific moment in television history when The Simpsons emerged. The show arrived at the beginning of the VCR era, when for the first time in television history, audiences had the ability to pause and rewind broadcast content. The show's creators were aware of this possibility and designed the show to reward it. The background details that would be invisible to a viewer watching in real time were placed there specifically for the audience that would eventually slow down and look. The show's use of language as a visual joke resource is one of its most consistently inventive qualities. Every written surface in Springfield is potentially a joke. Newspaper headlines, billboard advertisements, storefront signs, warning labels, legal notices posted outside public buildings, the names of businesses in the background of street scenes, all of these are populated with material that is carefully written and placed. The people responsible for this content within the show's art department are essentially writers, producing comedy that will be read by a small fraction of the audience and appreciated by an even smaller fraction. They do this anyway because the culture of the show demands it. Springfield's geography is perhaps the most consistently exploited source of visual background comedy in the show's history. The town contains businesses that should not coexist. A store that sells guns and wedding dresses, side by side and apparently thriving. A legal firm whose name, rendered in large letters above the door, is itself a four-word joke. A medical practice whose specialty, visible on the sign outside, suggests a level of narrow-mindedness in the healthcare system that is both satirical and somehow plausible. These businesses populate the town's commercial streets in episodes set in Springfield's downtown, and each one is an independently functioning joke that the show never needs to comment upon. The evolution of Springfield's design across 3 decades of production is something that animation historians have begun to document seriously. The early Springfield, rendered in the relatively flat color palette and somewhat rough line quality of the Klasky Csupo era, has a specific character that is distinct from the cleaner, more brightly colored Springfield of the film Roman era, and from the digitally precise Springfield of the contemporary show. Each phase of the show's production has left a visual fingerprint in the town's appearance. The buildings have the same names and occupy the same general positions, but the way they are lit, the way their surfaces are textured, the way the space between them is handled, changes across the decades in ways that reflect the shifting aesthetic priorities of the production. The Simpson house's interior has been mapped with considerable care by fans who have attempted to reconcile its various appearances across the show's history. The living room is the most consistent, the couch and the television in a fixed relationship that has been maintained across thousands of episodes. The kitchen is similarly stable, but the upper floor of the house, where the bedrooms are located, has been rendered inconsistently enough that a single definitive floor plan cannot be drawn. Bart's room has been shown in at least 3 different positions relative to Lisa's room, and the bathroom has appeared in at least 2 different locations. These are not errors that break the show's internal logic. They are simply evidence of the production reality of creating visual content at this volume and this speed, where perfect spatial consistency across hundreds of episodes is an impossible standard. The show's visual jokes about death are a specific category worth noting. The Simpsons is not a show that typically depicts death graphically, but it has developed a visual vocabulary for mortality that is both funny and strangely affecting. The show's Grim Reaper, who appears in several episodes, is always rendered with a specificity that suggests the art department approached the character as a genuine design challenge. The cemeteries in Springfield, which appear frequently in establishing shots and in episode-specific settings, are populated with headstones whose inscriptions are readable if you pause the episode and are funny if you read them. Death in Springfield is handled with the same combination of irreverence and genuine feeling that the show brings to everything else. The food in The Simpsons deserves its own consideration as a visual storytelling resource. Homer's relationship with food is one of the show's primary comedic registers, and the food that appears in Springfield, both the food Homer eats and the food that appears in the background of Springfield's restaurants and grocery stores, is designed with considerable attention. The Krusty Burger menu, visible in episodes set in the restaurant, is populated with items whose names and descriptions suggest a relationship with food safety standards that is purely theoretical. The food at Springfield Elementary's cafeteria, as noted earlier, is a masterpiece of visual comedy achieved through color choice and the suggestion of unidentifiable ingredients. The donuts at the Quick E-Mart, Homer's favored form of caloric intake, are always rendered in a specific warm golden brown that suggests their appeal even to viewers who are not hungry. The guest star tradition on The Simpsons has produced some of the most interesting behind-the-scenes stories in the show's history, stories about the collision between the show's specific comedic culture and the expectations and personalities of people who come from entirely different professional traditions. A rock star, a film actor, a professional athlete, a novelist, a political figure, all bring different preparation habits, different relationships with the material they are given, different degrees of comfort with the voice-only medium of animation recording. The show's guest star casting has functioned, across its history, as a kind of cultural barometer. The celebrities who were most eager to appear in the show's early years were primarily from the rock and comedy worlds, performers whose cultural positioning aligned with the show's irreverent sensibility. As the show's prestige grew, the range of guest categories expanded. Film actors who would previously have considered animated television beneath their notice began to appear. Athletes who would have had no particular reason to be interested in a cartoon sitcom found themselves at the recording booth. Nobel laureates were asked to voice versions of themselves. The expansion of the guest category tracked the expansion of the show's cultural footprint in a way that is historically interesting. The question of what makes a Simpsons guest appearance work as comedy is more specific than it might appear. The show has developed, across its history, a particular form of celebrity utilization that works best when it leverages the gap between the celebrity's public image and the situation the show places them in. The Ramones playing a birthday song for Mr. Burns works because the Ramones are the embodiment of a specific anti-establishment musical tradition, and Mr. Burns is the embodiment of everything that tradition stands against. The gap between those two things is the joke. When the show instead simply places a famous person in a situation that has no relationship to who they are or what they represent, the result is a guest appearance that is warmer in feeling but thinner in comedy. The show has occasionally used guest appearances to make specific artistic statements about its own cultural position. When Tom Jones appeared in an episode and performed within it, the joke operated on several levels simultaneously, making fun of a specific kind of easy-listening masculinity while also deploying it sincerely enough to produce a moment of genuine pleasure. When Leonard Nimoy appeared and essentially played a version of himself who had become permanently associated with one famous role, the show was acknowledging something real about the experience of that kind of cultural saturation. The best guest appearances on The Simpsons are not decorations. They are arguments. The logistics of coordinating guest appearances for a show that produces 22 episodes per year are more complex than audiences generally understand. The production team maintains a running list of performers they would like to use and is constantly in dialogue with talent representatives about availability and interest. Some guest appearances are planned a full season in advance, with episodes written specifically around a performer's confirmed availability. Others are more opportunistic, with a performer's availability creating an episode writing opportunity rather than the other way around. The finished product rarely reveals which category a particular guest appearance falls into, which is itself a mark of the production's skill. The show has been unusually successful at convincing famous people to play against their established images, to allow themselves to be made slightly foolish or slightly sinister or simply strange in ways that their normal professional presentation would not permit. This willingness to be diminished, or at least reduced, is something that the show's cultural prestige enables. Appearing on The Simpsons has for decades carried a specific form of cultural credibility that makes the temporary self-deprecation worthwhile for performers who might otherwise resist it. The show has consistently spent this credibility wisely, using it to produce performances from famous people that are more interesting and more generous than those people's usual public self-presentation. The institutional history of The Simpsons is, among other things, a study in how a creative enterprise survives its own success. Success creates pressures that struggle does not. A struggling show has the freedom of low expectations and the focused energy of people trying to prove something. A successful show carries the weight of what it has been, the demand that it remain what it was, the institutional complexity of managing a property that has become valuable to many more people than the ones who make it. The contract negotiations that the show has experienced at regular intervals across its history are expressions of this institutional complexity. The voice actors who created these characters are, by any reasonable assessment, irreplaceable. The specific performances they developed across the show's first decade are so thoroughly integrated into the audience's understanding of the characters that the characters and the performances have become inseparable. This gives the performers real leverage in negotiations, but also real responsibility. The show's continued existence depends on their participation, and their participation depends on the show continuing to be made in conditions that they find acceptable. The negotiating dynamic is genuinely complex and has never been simple to resolve. The creative crises of the show's history are harder to document than the contractual ones because they are less visible. When a contract negotiation goes badly, there is at minimum a public statement or a news report. When the writer's room spends 3 weeks failing to find a story that works, when a showrunner and a senior writer have a fundamental disagreement about the show's direction, when the quality of an episode is recognized as insufficient after it is already in production, these things rarely surface in contemporaneous reporting. They exist in the oral histories and DVD commentaries and occasional interviews that former staff members give years after the fact. The show's peak seasons, roughly 4 through 8 by the consensus of most serious critics and fans, were not produced in a condition of creative comfort. They were produced in a state of creative urgency that produced some of the most ambitious and formally inventive television comedy ever made. The writers of those seasons were aware that they were doing something significant, but they were also under enormous pressure to do more of it faster. The excellence of those seasons was not produced by people who had the leisure to be excellent. It was produced by people who were excellent despite not having that leisure, and in some cases because they didn't. The show's later seasons, which have been a subject of critical discussion and fan debate since at least the mid-2000s, are not uniformly bad in the way that the critical narrative sometimes suggests. There are good episodes in every season, including the most recent ones. What has changed is the density of excellence, the ratio of brilliant moments to routine ones. In the Golden Age seasons, the brilliant moments come so frequently and with such apparent effortlessness that they establish a baseline expectation that later seasons cannot meet. The individual good moments in the later seasons are not less good. They are simply less dense, with more routine material between them. The question of whether the show should have ended is one that the people who make it have been asked many times and have answered in many different ways. Some former showrunners and writers have suggested that the show stayed too long. Others argue that a show of this quality, still capable of producing good work, has no obligation to end on any schedule other than the one its audience and its network determine. The counter-argument that ending while still capable of greatness is itself a form of greatness is one that the show has conspicuously not made for itself. It keeps going. Whether this is admirable or regrettable is a question that each viewer must answer for themselves. The sonic world of The Simpsons is an underexplored dimension of the show's achievement. The attention that critics and fans pay to the writing, the animation, the voice performances as distinct from the music has left the show's extraordinary musical legacy somewhat underexamined. The fact that the show has produced original music of genuine quality across 36 seasons, including compositions that work as real songs independent of their comedic context, is remarkable and deserves more explicit recognition. Alf Clausen's compositional approach to the show's incidental music was shaped by a specific philosophy about the relationship between music and comedy. Clausen believed, and the show's track record supports this belief, that comedy is not served by music that underlines the joke, that adds another layer of signaling to something that is already funny. What comedy needs from its music, in his view, is emotional context that does not compete with the foreground humor. The music should tell you how to feel about the scene without commenting on the jokes within it. This is a subtler musical task than it sounds, and Clausen executed it with extraordinary consistency across decades of weekly production. The live orchestral recording approach that Clausen used is expensive and time-consuming relative to the synthesized or library-based approach that most animated series employ. The decision to sustain this approach across 25 seasons reflects a commitment to a specific quality of musical texture that the production considered essential. Live musicians bring a quality of slight imperfection, of breath and body, to a recording that synthesized music cannot replicate. This quality was audible in the show's musical accompaniment and contributed to the warmth of the show's overall sensibility in ways that are difficult to isolate but real. The show's original songs operate within a specific tradition of comedy songwriting that has roots in musical theater, in novelty songs, in the long American tradition of using popular music as a vehicle for satirical commentary. The best Simpsons songs are not simply comedy songs. They are comedy songs that understand the musical forms they are working with well enough to produce something that functions musically while simultaneously functioning as a joke. This dual competence is genuinely rare, and it is consistent enough across the show's history to suggest that it is a product of cultural intention rather than happy accident. The vocal performances in the show's musical numbers require the voice actors to draw on resources that their normal character work does not demand. Dan Castellaneta performing Homer's singing is a specific challenge, because Homer's singing should reflect Homer's musical limitations while also being funny and occasionally touching. The show has repeatedly used Homer's singing as an emotional access point, a way into his interior life that the character's normal mode of expression cannot provide. When Homer sings, even badly, there is a quality of genuine feeling that his speaking voice does not always produce. Castellaneta has been remarkable in his ability to calibrate this, to find the line between Homer's musical incompetence and something that is genuinely moving despite that incompetence. The show's relationship with classical music is one of its recurring comedic resources. Classical music in The Simpsons is almost always used to establish a gap between the elevated register that classical music represents and the low comedic content that is about to follow. Burns's preference for classical music is part of his characterization as someone who inhabits a world that has no meaningful overlap with the world inhabited by his employees. When classical music plays in a Simpson episode, the joke is usually about the incongruity between the music's implied world and Springfield's actual one. But the show's use of this joke is sophisticated enough that it sometimes subverts the expected incongruity, using classical music as a genuine emotional accompaniment in ways that produce something more complex than simple comic contrast. The technical evolution of The Simpsons animation across 36 seasons is a story about the broader transformation of the animation industry over the same period. The show began when animation was almost entirely a hand-drawn medium, when the movement of characters on screen was the product of thousands of individual drawings produced by human hands. It continues in an era when digital tools have transformed almost every aspect of the process. Living through this transformation while maintaining a visual identity that audiences recognize across the full span of the show's history is a remarkable production achievement. The transition from traditional to digital animation was not a simple switch from one system to another. It was a gradual migration, a process of integrating digital tools into workflows that had been built around traditional methods, a constant negotiation between the efficiency that digital tools offered and the visual qualities of traditional work that the show wanted to preserve. The people who managed this transition within the production were solving a problem that had no established template, because no animated series had been through anything quite like it before. The specific visual qualities that the show's art department has worked hardest to maintain across the transition are the qualities that make Springfield feel like Springfield rather than a generic animated world. The specific color relationships between the characters and their environments, the specific quality of the line that defines the character's forms, the specific way that light and shadow are handled in interior scenes. These qualities are easy to describe in general terms but difficult to specify precisely enough that they can be maintained consistently across production systems and production teams and production years. The art directors who have overseen these qualities across the show's history have done a largely invisible job of exceptional importance. The couch gag, as it has developed from a flexible production tool into a genuine creative showcase, represents the show's most explicit engagement with the history and possibilities of animation as a medium. Couch gags have cited virtually every significant movement in animation history, from the Golden Age Hollywood cartoons that Groening grew up watching, to the avant-garde experimental animation of the 1960s, to the Japanese anime tradition, to the digital animation of the contemporary era. The couch gag is a place where the show can acknowledge where animation has been and where it might be going, within a format that its audience will visit every week and that carries no narrative consequences. It is the show's laboratory. The work of the background artists on The Simpsons has never received the attention it deserves. These are the people responsible for the visual world that the characters inhabit, the world that gives the show its specific sense of place and time and socio-economic texture. The backgrounds of Springfield are not generic cartoon environments. They are specific, detailed, historically situated renderings of an American town that is simultaneously familiar and strange. The details visible in the backgrounds of Springfield streets, the specific brands visible in store windows, the specific state of repair of the buildings, the specific quality of the light in different times of day and different weather conditions, these are products of sustained artistic effort that most viewers receive as atmosphere without consciously recognizing the work behind them. The relationship between The Simpsons and the real world it emerged from and has helped shape is one of the most interesting case studies in American cultural history. The show did not simply reflect American culture in the way that a mirror reflects an image. It engaged with American culture actively, argued with it, satirized it, anticipated it, and in some cases demonstrably influenced it. The feedback loop between Springfield and the actual United States has been running for 36 years, and tracing its effects is a project that cultural historians are only beginning to undertake seriously. The show's political satire has always been its most culturally visible dimension. From the earliest seasons, The Simpsons engaged directly with the structures and failures of American political and civic life in ways that network comedy had rarely attempted. The show depicted a world in which institutional corruption was the norm, in which the gap between democratic rhetoric and democratic practice was enormous, in which power operated through wealth and connection rather than through any meaningful accountability to the people it affected. This was not an optimistic picture of American democracy, and it was produced for broadcast network television, which is not a medium typically associated with radical political critique. The show's political positions, to the extent that it can be said to have consistent positions rather than a consistent satirical sensibility, are harder to categorize than casual observers often assume. The show has satirized both liberals and conservatives across its history, though the specific targets and the specific register of the satire have not been perfectly symmetrical. The show's sympathies, to the extent they are legible in its 36-year body of work, seem to lie with ordinary people against powerful institutions, rather than with any particular ideological tradition. This is not a precise political position, but it is a consistent one. The show's engagement with American economic life is one of its most coherent and most specifically situated political statements. Springfield's economy is dominated by a single employer, a dangerous industrial facility operated by an amoral billionaire. The town's political culture is thoroughly captured by this employer's interests. The town's residents are economically dependent on an institution that is actively harming them. This is not a cartoon fantasy. It is an accurate description of the economic and political dynamics of many American communities, and the show has been describing it since 1989. The show's relationship to the specific American working-class experience of the late 20th century is something that cultural scholars have begun to examine with increasing seriousness. Homer Simpson is not simply a buffoon. He is a specific kind of American worker, a man who entered the industrial labor force through inheritance and habit rather than through choice or skill, who does a job that he does not understand in a facility whose dangers he has been socialized not to notice. who earns enough to maintain a household and provide for a family but who has no genuine agency over his professional life. This is a recognizable portrait of a specific form of American labor experience, and the show has been rendering it with comic fidelity for more than 3 decades. The show's influence on American language and reference is one of its most diffuse and most significant cultural contributions. Phrases that originated in the show have entered everyday American speech in ways that their speakers are often no longer aware of. The show has contributed to the American vocabulary not just specific words and phrases, but specific rhetorical modes, specific patterns of irony and self-reference that have become so widespread in American comedy that their Simpsons origin is invisible. The show is part of the water now. It is in the culture so deeply that it is difficult to see where the show ends and the culture begins. The experience of loving The Simpsons for a long time, of having watched it across decades and through different stages of life and with different levels of critical attention, produces a specific relationship to the show that is worth naming. It is not simple nostalgia, though nostalgia is part of it. It is not pure aesthetic appreciation, though the show at its best repays the deepest aesthetic attention. It is something closer to what you feel about a place you have returned to many times across many years, a place that is always recognizable and always slightly different, a place that holds memories of who you were when you were there before. The show has been a companion to more people for longer than almost any other piece of American culture. It has been the background noise of Sunday evenings for 3 generations. People have grown up with it, moved away from it, returned to it. People have watched it with parents who are now gone, and with children who have not yet been born. The show exists not just as a text but as a temporal marker, a way of placing yourself in your own history. I was watching The Simpsons when this happened. I was a child the first time I saw this episode. I watch this one with my kids now. This temporal dimension of the show's relationship to its audience is one of the things that the floating timeline produces, paradoxically. Because the characters never age, the show becomes a fixed point against which the viewer can measure their own passage through time. Bart is always 10, but the viewer who was 10 when they first watched Bart is now 40. The gap between what has not changed and what has is the specific form of time that The Simpsons makes visible. The show is a clock that only shows you the time by showing you what hasn't moved. The question of what the show ultimately says about American life, the final argument of 36 seasons of sustained satirical observation, is one that resists a simple answer. The show has said so many things across its history, some of them contradictory, some of them timely and some timeless, some hopeful and some deeply dark, that any single thesis statement would be a reduction. What can be said is that the show has been honest, more consistently honest about the gap between American aspirations and American realities than most of its contemporaries in the broadcast medium. It has depicted a family that is deeply flawed and deeply loving, a community that is damaged and still somehow coherent, a world that is corrupt and still somehow livable. This is not a flattering portrait of America, but it may be an accurate one. The decision to keep making the show, which is renewed every year and has been for more than 3 decades, is made by people who believe that the show still has things to say and an audience that still wants to hear them. Whether those beliefs are accurate is a judgment that history will make more clearly than we can in the present moment. What we can say is that the show's longevity is itself a cultural fact of extraordinary significance, evidence of something in Springfield that keeps people coming back year after year, even when they have reservations about what they find there. The final mystery of The Simpsons, the one that sits beneath all the other mysteries the show has generated across its history, is the mystery of why stories about people who cannot grow and a town that cannot change have produced one of the most sustained and significant engagements with the experience of change in American culture. The show is about stasis, but its effect on the people who watch it is about time. It catches you where you are and holds you there long enough that when you look up, you notice how far everything else has moved. The frozen clock in the frozen town makes every viewer aware of their own motion through time. Springfield is still there. It will be there next week. It will be there next year. The Simpsons will keep going until it doesn't, which is not a prophecy but a certainty in the way that all things are eventually certain. And when it ends, if it ends, there will be many millions of people for whom a specific kind of Sunday evening disappears from the world. Not the television. The feeling that Springfield is about to open its doors and let you in for another half hour among people you have known for most of your life. That is what the show is. That is what it has always been. Not a prediction machine or a radiation parable or a coma dream, though it has been all of those things in the specific register of interpretation and love that the show inspires. It is a place that does not exist on any map and that you can find any time you want to look for it. And that after 199 facts and 36 years and 800 and something episodes might be the one true thing about it. There is a particular quality to the experience of watching a very long-running television series, one that does not apply to watching a film or reading a novel or consuming almost any other form of narrative entertainment. When you watch something that has been going for 36 years, you are not watching a thing. You are watching a relationship. The relationship between a creative team and their material. The relationship between a show and its audience. The relationship between a set of fictional characters and the culture that has received them, absorbed them, argued about them, and decided to keep them. The Simpsons has earned this relationship in a specific way. Not through consistent excellence, which it has not maintained, but through consistent presence combined with intermittent, extraordinary achievement. The show has not always been great. It has been great often enough that its audience has remained willing to stay through the less great periods, hoping for the next thing that reminds them why they came. This is not the relationship of pure artistic devotion. It is the relationship of long familiarity, of knowing a person well enough that you do not require them to be at their best every time you see them. What follows are additional observations, additional small histories, additional facts that belong in the record of this extraordinary ordinary show. On Springfield's relationship with alcohol, the show has depicted alcohol as a constant presence in Springfield's social life in ways that a network standards office might find alarming if they examined it from a certain angle. Moe's Tavern is not simply a setting. It is an institution that the show treats as a genuine center of community life, a place where the residents of Springfield process their anxieties and their failures, and their occasional small victories. The bar as the working man's church is an old American cultural tradition, and the show has rendered it with a specificity that goes beyond simple stereotype. Moe is a failure as a businessman and as a human being in many respects. He is also, within the logic of the show, a genuine community resource. The people who drink at his bar are better for having somewhere to go. This is a complicated thing for a family comedy to be saying, and the show has been saying it, quietly, since the first season. Homer's relationship with Duff Beer is one of the show's most consistent character details and one of its more interesting implicit arguments. Homer drinks beer the way he does everything else, with total commitment and zero self-awareness about the consequences. The show has occasionally acknowledged the damage that Homer's drinking does, most notably in the Season 4 episode Duffless, where Homer gives up beer for a month and discovers that sobriety allows him to notice things about his life that drinking had been covering. The episode ends with Homer choosing to return to drinking, which is either a statement about the limits of self-improvement or a statement about the necessity of whatever helps a person survive the gap between the life they have and the life they imagined. The show does not adjudicate between these readings. It simply shows you Homer's choice and moves on. Barney Gumble, Homer's best friend since childhood, is the show's most extended meditation on the tragedy of alcoholism. Barney was, we learn across various flashback episodes, genuinely brilliant before the drinking took hold. He had aspirations. He had abilities. He had a future that alcohol slowly replaced with the stool at the end of Moe's bar. The show has handled Barney's alcoholism with varying degrees of seriousness across its history. Some episodes treat it as a source of comedy in ways that feel slightly uncomfortable to contemporary audiences. Others engage with it as genuine tragedy, as the story of a person whose life was stolen by a substance and who has made his peace with the theft in the only way available to him, which is to stop noticing it. The episode in which Barney gets sober, discovers filmmaking, and then relapses is one of the show's quietly devastating pieces of character writing. On the show's treatment of intelligence, The Simpsons has consistently depicted intelligence as both a gift and a burden, which is a more nuanced position than most American entertainment takes on the subject. The conventional American narrative about intelligence treats it as an uncomplicated positive quality, something that leads naturally to success and recognition. The show's version is considerably darker. Lisa is brilliant, and her brilliance isolates her. She is more capable of understanding the world around her than almost anyone in Springfield, and this capability does not bring her happiness. It brings her frustration, loneliness, and an awareness of suffering that she cannot switch off. The episode in which Homer has the crayon removed from his brain and his IQ briefly rises to genius level is one of the show's most formally clever explorations of this theme. Smart Homer is articulate, perceptive, and immediately miserable. He can see the problems with his life and with Springfield that his normal self cannot perceive. He can understand the architecture of his own suffering in ways that make the suffering worse rather than better. And he chooses, deliberately, to return to the previous state. This is either a deeply sad story about the impossibility of escape from one's condition, or a deeply funny story about a man who genuinely prefers not to think too hard about things, or both simultaneously, which is where the show tends to live when it is at its best. The show has also depicted intelligence as a resource that systems actively work to suppress. Burns' decision to keep Homer employed despite his extraordinary incompetence is, as the show has built the mythology of their relationship, not simply a matter of Burns' indifference to his workers' capabilities. It is a deliberate strategy. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down. Homer ensures the violations continue. The system, as the show has constructed it, has a vested interest in keeping its participants slightly less capable than they could be. This is a genuinely dark claim about institutional power, rendered so consistently across the show's mythology that it cannot be read as an accident. On the show's recurring visual language for emotion, The Simpsons has developed, across its history, a specific visual vocabulary for emotional states that is as consistent and as meaningful as its verbal one. The way Homer's eyes go slightly glassy when he is experiencing genuine feeling, rather than cartoon surprise or cartoon anger, is a specific animation choice that carries meaning. The way Lisa's mouth changes shape when she is about to cry versus when she is about to argue is a distinction that the animators and directors have maintained with remarkable consistency. The way Marge's hair deflates slightly, metaphorically, in scenes where she is exhausted by the demands being made on her patience, is a visual metaphor that the show deploys with care. These visual emotional cues are part of what gives the show's best emotional moments their power. The animation does not simply illustrate what the voice track says. It comments on it, extends it, adds information that the dialogue does not contain. A character can say one thing and the animation can show you what they actually feel, and the gap between those two things can be the most interesting part of the scene. This is sophisticated visual storytelling, the kind of thing that requires close attention to produce and that rewards close attention to receive. The specific visual language that the show uses for Homer's relationship with food is worth examining in this context. When Homer eats something he loves, the animation does not simply show him chewing. It shows a quality of absorption, of complete presence, that the character rarely achieves in any other context. Homer in the presence of good food is Homer fully alive, fully engaged with his immediate experience, incapable of the distraction and inattention that characterize his behavior in virtually every other situation. This is funny because the contrast is funny. It is also quietly revealing, because it shows you something real about Homer's relationship with pleasure and with the difficulty of accessing pleasure in the rest of his life. On the specific geography of Springfield's social world. The social world of Springfield is more precisely mapped than the show's deliberately vague physical geography might suggest. The class structure of the town is rendered with considerable specificity across dozens of episodes. Burns is at the apex, isolated by wealth from any meaningful connection with the community he controls. The professional class of Springfield, the doctors, lawyers, teachers, and media figures, occupies a middle tier that is considerably more comfortable than the workers, but considerably less powerful than Burns. The working class, Homer and his neighbors, occupies the majority of the show's social world. And below the visible working class is a stratum of Springfield's residents who exist on the economic margins, whose precarity is occasionally the subject of episodes and more often simply the background texture of life in the town. The specific mechanics of class mobility in Springfield are a recurring subject of the show's storytelling. Homer occasionally rises temporarily out of his class position through a windfall or a promotion or an unusually successful scheme, and the show examines what happens to him in that position with considerable interest. He does not flourish. He does not find that the class above his is more satisfying or more coherent than his own. He finds that it is differently limited, that the problems of wealth are real problems, even if they are different problems, and that the world he belongs to is the world on Evergreen Terrace rather than in Burns's mansion or in the country club on the edge of town. The show has also depicted, across its history, the specific experience of being a woman in Springfield's social world. Marge's position as a housewife and mother in a community that simultaneously respects and limits that position is one of the show's ongoing considerations. The episodes in which Marge steps outside the domestic role, in which she tries something new, pursues something for herself, tests her capabilities in a context that is not defined by her relationship to her family, are consistently among the show's most interesting. They are interesting partly because they depict what Marge is capable of when she is given the space to be capable, and partly because they always return Marge to Springfield, to the house, to the family. The world she would occupy if she could choose freely is always available to her in glimpses and always unavailable to her as a permanent condition. On the show's relationship with its own history, one of the stranger aspects of The Simpsons at this stage of its existence is its relationship to its own past. The show contains within it the memory of everything it has been, all the versions of itself it has inhabited across 36 seasons. This historical self-awareness is sometimes a resource and sometimes a burden. When the show references its own earlier episodes, it can be a form of genuine continuity, an acknowledgement that these characters have a history that the current episode is aware of. It can also be a form of self-congratulation, a moment where the show pauses to acknowledge how long it has been doing this instead of actually doing it. The most interesting uses of the show's historical self-awareness are the ones that use the past as genuine dramatic material rather than as nostalgic reference. The episodes that return to earlier versions of the characters, that depict how Homer and Marge met, how the family was constituted before the audience arrived, how Springfield came to be the place it is, are using the show's history as a living resource. The earlier versions of Springfield and its residents exist in the viewer's imagination alongside the current versions, and the gap between them is where the most emotionally complex material can be found. The show's earliest episodes exist in a relationship with the contemporary episodes that is not simply a matter of quality or style. They are documents of a different moment in American cultural history, a moment before the internet changed public discourse, before the specific political polarization of the contemporary era, before the transformations in media and technology and social life that the subsequent 3 decades have produced. Watching a first-season episode in 2025 is an act of time travel in a way that watching a contemporary episode is not. The contemporary episodes are of the present. The early episodes are of a past that feels both close and distant in ways that are difficult to articulate. On what the show does that nothing else does. There is a specific thing that The Simpsons does that very few other cultural objects have managed to do, which is to be simultaneously funny and sad and honest about the specific texture of ordinary American life, and to maintain this combination across a sustained run of extraordinary length. The films and novels and plays that deal seriously with the experience of ordinary American life are often too serious to be funny. The comedies that deal with the same experience are often too funny to be serious. The Simpsons has lived in the space between these positions for 36 years, and the occupation of that space is its specific and irreplaceable achievement. The honesty of the show is not the kind of honesty that announces itself. It does not feel like a documentary or a social essay. It feels like comedy, which is what it is. But beneath the comedy, running through it, informing every joke, is a genuine understanding of what it is to be alive in the specific conditions of late 20th and early 21st century America. The financial anxiety that never fully disappears no matter how much you earn. The gap between the life you imagined and the life you have. The love that persists through incompatibility and frustration and years of accumulated disappointment. The moments of genuine joy that arrive unexpectedly in circumstances that do not seem designed to produce joy. The children who grow up while you are looking elsewhere. The parents who are always more complicated than you had the capacity to understand when you were young enough to need their complexity to be simple. These are the things that The Simpsons has been describing, in its own voice, in its own way, since December 17, 1989. And this is why 199 facts can barely scratch the surface of what the show is. The facts are true, the production history is fascinating, the cultural analysis is revealing, but the show itself is larger than any description of it. It is a family. It is a town. It is a weekly appointment with something that knows you better than you might be comfortable admitting. And it is still there, still going, still opening its door every week and letting you in. That is the final fact, and it is the only one that matters. Details that deserve their own space. Every show that runs long enough produces a catalog of small things, moments that are too minor to anchor an analysis but too interesting to leave unmentioned. Observations about specific episodes, specific performances, specific production choices that illuminate something real about the show without rising to the level of a major thematic statement. The Simpsons has been running long enough to accumulate one of the richest such catalogs in television history. What follows is a selection from that catalog, offered without hierarchy, in the spirit of the late-night viewing experience that this script is designed to accompany. On The Simpsons and Books. The Simpsons has maintained a consistent relationship with literature across its history that is more serious than the show's reputation as a pop culture phenomenon might suggest. Lisa's reading, her development as an intellectual, her relationship with books as a form of companionship and aspiration, has been treated as a genuine subject rather than a simple character shorthand. The specific titles that Lisa reads across the show's history form an interesting reading list. They tend toward ambitious literary fiction and serious nonfiction, the kind of reading that a genuinely gifted child with no peers and too much time might pursue. The show has also used literature as a source of satirical reference in ways that require genuine knowledge of the texts being satirized. The episode that sends Bart to France draws on a tradition of American innocence abroad that goes back to Henry James and Mark Twain. The episode that parodies The Shining demonstrates a serious engagement with Stephen King's novel and Kubrick's film that goes beyond simple recognition gag into something that understands why those texts work and what makes them. Available for comedic reworking. The show's literary literacy has been one of its less noticed virtues. Homer's relationship with books is the inverse of Lisa's. Homer does not read. He has been shown trying to read on several occasions, and the results are invariably comic. But the comedy is not simply about Homer's stupidity. It is about the specific experience of encountering a text that was not designed for you, of trying to find an access point into a world of meaning that has been organized around assumptions that do not match your own. This is a more sympathetic portrayal of the non-reader than most American comedy achieves, and it is consistent with the show's generally sympathetic treatment of Homer's limitations. On Springfield's institutional architecture, the institutional buildings of Springfield, its schools, its courthouse, its police station, its hospital, its television station, its nuclear plant, form a kind of physical argument about the relationship between institutions and the communities they serve. Each of these buildings is designed, in the show's visual language, to communicate something specific about the institution it houses. Springfield Elementary is visually cramped and slightly oppressive, a building that was designed for a different population in a different era and has been maintained at the minimum standard necessary to avoid complete collapse. The police station has a quality of casual disorder, a building that processes human misfortune without any particular investment in the outcomes. Springfield General Hospital is clean enough to suggest the possibility of medical competence while consistently failing to deliver on that possibility. The nuclear power plant is the most architecturally expressive building in Springfield's landscape. Its cooling towers dominate the skyline in a way that makes the plant's presence inescapable from virtually every vantage point in the town. The plant is always visible in Springfield, always there in the background, always reminding you of what powers the town and what that power costs. The architectural prominence of the plant is itself a form of storytelling, a constant visual reminder that the show never lets you fully escape the central fact of Springfield's economy and its central hazard. Burns's mansion sits at a deliberate remove from the rest of Springfield, elevated and isolated in a way that marks the difference between wealth and the community it depends on. The mansion is larger than Springfield can quite accommodate, a building that belongs to a different scale than the rest of the town's architecture. The show has used the mansion's interior as a canvas for jokes about the specific pathologies of extreme wealth, the rooms full of useless objects, the mechanical systems that have not been updated since the 1920s, the servants who have been with Burns long enough to have lost track of when they started. The mansion is a portrait of wealth as a form of arrested development, a condition in which the accumulation of resources has continued long past the point where any of it serves any identifiable human purpose. On the show's relationship with sports, The Simpsons has engaged with American sports culture more extensively than most network comedies, and its engagement has been sophisticated enough to produce episodes that work both as satire and as genuine sports stories. Homer at the Bat, which aired in the third season and featured a remarkable ensemble of real Major League Baseball players voicing themselves, is the most celebrated sports episode in the show's history and one of the most celebrated episodes overall. Its genius lies in using the conceit of a celebrity-stacked softball team to tell a story about the gap between celebrity and ordinary achievement, about what it means to be very good at something in a context that does not have the resources to properly appreciate it. The show's treatment of football, basketball, and other American sports has been less focused than its treatment of baseball, but equally willing to engage with the specific absurdities of American sports culture. The commodification of athletic achievement, the relationship between sports teams and the municipalities that support them, the specific economics of professional athletics, in which the labor that produces the entertainment receives a smaller share of the revenue than the capital that organizes it. These are subjects that the show has touched on across dozens of episodes without ever making any single episode primarily about them. Homer's athletic career, or rather his series of brief athletic careers across different sports and different contexts, is one of the show's recurring comic resources. Homer proves, repeatedly, that he has specific physical talents that his general incompetence conceals. He can bowl. He can box, briefly. He can participate in a demolition derby with alarming effectiveness. These unexpected competencies are funny because they violate the established expectation of Homer as someone without skills. They are also revealing because they suggest that the conditions of Homer's life have suppressed capabilities that would have manifested if given appropriate encouragement. Homer is not maximally stupid. He is inadequately resourced. On the show's treatment of childhood, The Simpsons is, among other things, a show about childhood. Not in the way that a children's show is about childhood, as a celebration or an idealization of the child's experience, but in the way that adult memory is about childhood, as a terrain that is simultaneously familiar and strange, that contains moments of genuine joy and genuine suffering in roughly equal measure, that recedes into the past while remaining present in the habits and responses and wounds that adulthood carries forward. The childhood experiences depicted in the show's flashback episodes are specific and resonant in ways that suggest they are drawn from real experience, whether Groening's or the writers, or both. Homer's childhood in particular is rendered with a combination of comedy and genuine sadness that is characteristic of the show at its best. The young Homer who grows up with an absent mother and an emotionally unavailable father, who carries a crayon lodged in his brain that no doctor notices or removes, who becomes the person he becomes partly through the specific injuries of his specific childhood, is a portrait that uses comedy to describe damage that is real and lasting. Bart's childhood is somewhat simpler in its rendering than Homer's, but it has its own specific texture. Bart is a child who lives entirely in the present moment, who has very little capacity for anticipation or retrospection, who experiences the world as a constant fresh encounter with whatever is immediately in front of him. This makes him exhausting to be around and genuinely interesting to watch. Bart does not plan. He responds. His responses are often catastrophic, occasionally brilliant, always immediate. There is something specific to a certain kind of childhood, the childhood of a boy who is too energetic for the environments designed to contain him, that the show renders through Bart with genuine fidelity. On the specific comedy of Springfield's media landscape, the media world of Springfield, its local television station, its newspaper, its radio stations, is one of the show's most consistently productive comedic environments. Kent Brockman's willingness to deliver any information in the same assured, concerned register is a joke about broadcast journalism that has only become more accurate with time. The ability of a certain kind of broadcast presenter to maintain exactly the same quality of confident authority while discussing a bake sale and a nuclear threat is a real quality of real television journalism, and the show identified it as a satirical target early and has returned to it consistently. The Springfield Shopper's coverage of local events is a window into a version of small-town journalism that is at once affectionately observed and gently savage. The Shopper covers the events of Springfield with a breathless seriousness that is both recognizable and absurd. Its front pages, visible as background details in episodes set in the newspaper's orbit, are consistently funny in their rendering of what counts as news in a community where the actual news, the nuclear contamination, the institutional corruption, the billionaire who controls everything, goes unreported. The radio stations of Springfield, heard in background contexts across dozens of episodes, have their own specific character. The country music station whose programming consists entirely of songs about lost trucks and injured horses. The talk radio host whose views are not specified but whose manner is instantly recognizable. the classical music station that manages to sound both high-minded and slightly desperate. These are audio details that most viewers never fully register, but that contribute to the total sonic portrait of a specific kind of American community. On the show's final argument about happiness, The Simpsons, for all its darkness, is not a pessimistic show. This is not the obvious statement it might appear to be. A show that has spent 36 years depicting institutional corruption, environmental catastrophe, cognitive damage, class stagnation, and the systematic suppression of truth could very easily be a pessimistic show. The reason it is not is specific and worth naming. The show believes in happiness, not the large institutional happiness of a society that is functioning as it should, which Springfield manifestly is not, but the small, personal happiness of people who find each other and choose each other and manage, despite everything, to create something worth having in the spaces between the disasters. The happiness that Homer finds in a good donut. The happiness that Lisa finds in a piece of music that says what she cannot say out loud. The happiness that Bart finds in a perfect prank that works exactly as planned. The happiness that Marge finds in moments when her family, impossibly, is all in the same place at the same time and briefly at peace. These small happinesses are not presented as compensation for the larger failures of Springfield's world. They are not the show making peace with the status quo or suggesting that personal joy makes institutional dysfunction acceptable. They are something more modest and more honest than that. They are the show acknowledging that human life contains real pleasure even in damaged conditions, and that the pleasure is real even though the conditions are damaged. This is not a political position. It is an observation about experience, and the show has been making it with consistency and with grace for 36 years. The last thing the show wants you to feel, at the end of any episode, is not despair about Springfield's problems. It wants you to feel what you feel when you sit with people you love, when the evening is long and the company is warm, and nothing is required of you except presence. It wants you to feel at home, in Springfield, which is every American home, and no specific American home, which is your home more than you might expect if you look at it the right way. That is what the show has always wanted. That is what it still wants. And after 36 years and 800 episodes and 199 facts, that desire, simple and sincere and slightly embarrassing in its simplicity, is the thing that has not changed. Springfield is still there. The family is still together. The door is still open. There is a specific kind of education that happens in the dark, in front of a television screen, over many years. The education that does not feel like education because it arrives in the form of jokes and cartoon voices and the specific warm light of a Sunday evening. The Simpsons has been conducting this education for 36 years, and it is worth, in these final pages of this long night in Springfield, accounting for some of what it taught, on what the show taught about class. The Simpsons taught a generation of American viewers to see class in a specific way, which is to say it taught them to see it at all. American culture has a strong tradition of denying that class exists, of insisting that the category of working class or middle class or upper class does not describe anything real or morally significant about American life, that what matters is individual effort and individual reward, and that the systems within which individual effort operates are essentially fair. The show never argued against this tradition explicitly. It simply depicted a world in which the class you were born into determined the parameters of your life with a consistency and a finality that the American mythology of individual effort could not account for. Homer did not choose his job. He was pointed toward the power plant by a combination of economic necessity and the absence of alternatives. He stayed in the job not because it was satisfying or because it paid well, but because the deal between Burns and his grandfather made leaving practically impossible, and because the emotional damage of his childhood had produced a person who was constitutionally incapable of imagining himself in a different kind of life. These are the mechanics of class stagnation, rendered in the form of a cartoon, and the show has been depicting them since its earliest seasons. Burns did not earn his position. He inherited it. The Burns dynasty, as the show has constructed it across dozens of episodes and throwaway references, is a dynasty of accumulated advantage, of wealth begetting wealth, of influence begetting influence, in ways that have nothing to do with Burns's personal merits and everything to do with the specific historical accident of his family's initial position. Burns is not smarter than the people he employs. He is not more capable, more virtuous, more useful to society. He simply started from a position that compounded into dominance across generations in ways that no individual merit could have produced or can overcome. The gap between these two positions, Homer's and Burns's, is the show's most persistent subject and its most political one. The show has never suggested that this gap is inevitable or acceptable, but it has also never suggested that it is easily or quickly closable. The show lives in the gap. It renders the gap in comedy and tragedy and surrealism, and occasionally, in the show's best episodes, in something that approaches genuine moral seriousness. The gap is real. The show has been saying so for 36 years. On What the Show Taught About Marriage, Homer and Marge's marriage is one of the most extended examinations of a marital relationship in the history of American television. It has been observed across hundreds of episodes, in conditions ranging from domestic routine to existential crisis, and it has been rendered with a consistency that reveals something real about what makes marriages last and what makes them worth the effort. The show has never depicted Homer and Marge's marriage as easy. It has never suggested that they are naturally suited to each other in the way that romantic comedy suggests couples are naturally suited to each other. They are very different people. Homer is impulsive, irresponsible, emotionally underdeveloped, and constitutionally incapable of thinking very far ahead. Marge is patient, conscientious, emotionally intelligent, and perpetually burdened by the gap between the life she might have had and the life she chose. The fact that these two people remain married across 36 seasons is not a statement about compatibility. It is a statement about choice. The show has depicted the choice that keeps Homer and Marge together as something that is made repeatedly in small ways across the accumulated days of a long marriage. It is made when Marge could reasonably give up and doesn't. It is made when Homer could reasonably stop trying and manages, against his own inclinations, to try one more time. It is made in the small moments of recognition, of tenderness, of humor shared between two people who know each other well enough to find the funny thing in their own ongoing improbability. The marriage works within the show's logic, not because it should work by any conventional measure, but because the people in it keep deciding that it will. This is a more honest account of how marriages work than most American television has been willing to provide. Marriages do not survive because the people in them are perfectly matched. They survive because the people in them are willing to keep doing the work of being together, even when the work is hard, even when the match is imperfect, even when the life they are living together is considerably different from the life either of them originally imagined. Homer and Marge have been teaching this lesson, in the form of a cartoon, since December 1989. On What the Show Taught About Parenting. The Simpsons is a show about parenting that has never pretended that parenting is simple, satisfying, or done correctly very often. Homer is a terrible parent by conventional standards. He is inattentive, physically dangerous to his children on several occasions, incapable of the sustained focus that good parenting requires, and emotionally limited in ways that prevent him from giving his children what they need most of the time. And yet the show has also depicted, across hundreds of episodes, that Homer loves his children with a depth and a sincerity that his limitations do not diminish. The episode And Maggie Makes Three, which reveals that the photographs of Maggie at Homer's workstation exist to cover a demoralizing sign because looking at Maggie makes the misery of the job survivable, is one of the show's purest renderings of parental love. Not the love that comes from competence and conscious nurturing, but the love that is simply there, that survives the parent's own inadequacy and selfishness and distraction. That is the thing the parent returns to when everything else has been stripped away. Homer at his worst is still a man who loves his children. The show has insisted on this across every season, in the face of every piece of evidence that would complicate the claim. Marge's parenting is different from Homer's, and receives less explicit treatment in the show, partly because it is less dramatically interesting, and partly because its virtuousness makes it harder to render as comedy. Marge is a good mother in ways that are not very funny. She pays attention. She advocates for her children's needs. She maintains the household routines that give the children's lives structure and security. She holds things together. These are the invisible labors of good parenting, the ones that only become visible when they stop happening, and the show has honored them in the specific way that comedy honors things it cannot easily joke about, which is by noticing them quietly and moving on. On What the Show Taught About Friendship. The Simpsons has depicted friendship as something that exists between people who do not, by any rational assessment, belong together. Homer and Barney are friends not because they have much in common beyond their history and their shared location at the end of Moe's bar, but because friendship is often constituted by history and shared location rather than by rational compatibility. Homer and Lenny and Carl are friends through the specific institution of their shared workplace, held together by the daily proximity of spending 8 hours or so in the same building, performing the same inadequate safety oversight of the same dangerous facility. These are friendships of circumstance, which is to say they are the most common kind of friendship, and the show has rendered them with the specific warmth that circumstantial friendship produces. The friendship between Lisa and her occasional intellectual peers, the brief connections she makes across the show's history with people who can match her register of engagement with the world, are always poignant because they are always temporary. Lisa's intelligence is a barrier to sustained friendship in Springfield because there is no one in Springfield who inhabits the same intellectual world she does. The friends she makes and loses across the show's history are mirrors that show her what her life could look like in a different context, and their departure is always a small loss that the show treats with more tenderness than the comedy of the situation might seem to require. On the show's relationship with failure, The Simpsons is, at its core, a show about failure. Not the grand, spectacular failure that provides narrative drama, but the ordinary, everyday failure of people who try and come up short repeatedly, who learn the same lessons over and over without quite managing to implement them, who are constituted by their limitations in ways that they cannot fully overcome. This is an unusual subject for entertainment, because entertainment typically prefers people who succeed, or at least people who fail dramatically enough to produce good story. Homer's failures are the show's primary comedic resource and its primary emotional one. He fails at his job continuously. He fails as a parent intermittently. He fails as a husband occasionally. He fails at every scheme he undertakes with such reliable completeness that his failure has become a kind of reliability, the one thing about Homer that can be counted on, and the show has spent 36 years finding the comedy and the humanity in this reliable failure. It has found that failure, rendered honestly, produces something that is both funnier and more moving than success. It has found that the person who keeps trying despite consistent failure is, in some respects, more admirable than the person who succeeds. The show has also depicted the specific kind of failure that comes from the gap between aspiration and capacity. Homer wants things that he is not capable of having. He wants to be respected. He wants to be recognized. He wants to be the kind of father and husband that a man with his limitations cannot quite manage to be. These are real wants, wants that the show takes seriously even as it renders their pursuit as comedy. The gap between what Homer wants and what Homer is capable of is not funny because the wanting is pathetic. It is funny because the wanting is so recognizable, so ordinary, so human. Homer wants what everyone wants. He simply lacks the tools to get it. And the show has been describing this specific condition with love and without condescension for 3.5 decades. One last thing before the credits roll. You have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. You have heard about its origins and its characters and its writing and its music and its animation and its cultural significance and its place in the long history of American television. You have heard about the people who made it and the decisions they made and the consequences those decisions produced. And you have heard, running beneath all of this, the quieter story that the show tells without quite saying it out loud. The story about a family and a town and a culture that keeps going despite itself, that finds reasons to continue in circumstances that do not make continuing easy. That is the show. That has always been the show. The facts are the frame. The feeling is the picture. Every episode of The Simpsons begins the same way. A slightly different version of a familiar opening sequence, a couch gag that is always a surprise, a family that is always recognizable, the routine and the variation existing in the same space, which is itself a small argument about how life works. The thing that stays the same makes room for the thing that changes. The thing that changes gives meaning to the thing that stays the same. The smallest true thing, delivered with care, lands harder than the largest false one delivered with spectacle. That is the lesson Springfield keeps teaching. That is the lesson worth carrying home. Springfield is still there. The family is still together. The door is still open. And whenever you want to go back, it will be waiting for you. Exactly as you left it. Exactly as you always remembered it. Good night.